As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So Putin showed this document and said, quote, "As you know, a string of talks between Russia and Ukraine took place in Turkey so as to work out both the confidence-building measures you mentioned and to draw up the text of the agreement. We did not discuss with the Ukrainian side that this treaty would be classified, but we have never presented it nor commented on it. The draft agreement was initialed by the head of the Kiev negotiation team. He put his signature there," end quote. And he pointed to the signature. So according to RT, the treaty, which is titled the Permanent Neutrality and Security Guarantees for Ukraine, it required Ukraine to enshrine permanent neutrality in its constitution, and the US, Britain, Russia, China, and France are listed as guarantors for Ukraine. And since the treaty was a draft, that means that it wasn't finalized and more details, need to be worked out. I'm sure there's a lot of questions about these security guarantees that these countries were supposedly going to give. But Putin's claim reflects an article that was published in Foreign Affairs last year, which cited multiple former senior officials who said that Ukraine and Russia tentatively agreed on a peace deal in April 2022. They said that the agreement would have involved a Ukrainian promise not to join NATO in exchange for a Russian withdrawal to the pre-invasion lines, and Ukraine would have received security guarantees from several countries. Russian and Ukrainian officials met face-to-face in Istanbul, Turkey on March 29th, 2022. So those negotiations were followed up by virtual consultations. So what's interesting is that after that meeting, that same day, I remember this because I wrote an article about it, Russia's lead negotiator, said the talks were constructive, and the Russian Defense Ministry announced that it would drastically reduce military activity near Kiev, because when Russia first invaded, they came in from the north from Belarus. And this led to the complete Russian withdrawal from the north there. So, it was timed with these talks, and they said they were pulling out to foster more peace talks. Putin said that after the Russian withdrawal, Ukraine abandoned the treaty. He said, quote, "We pulled our troops away from Kiev as we had promised to do. The Kiev authorities tossed their commitments into the dustbin of history. They abandoned everything," end quote. So Ukraine accused Russian troops of intentionally killing civilians in the northern areas that it withdrew from, most notably in the Kiev suburb of Bucha, or Bucha. I forget which way you pronounce it. But if Putin's account is true, Western pressure could have also led to Ukraine scuttling the treaty. So this is, some background that I've gone over a lot, but we know that Boris Johnson, when he was the prime minister to the UK, he went to Kiev on April 9th, which was just a few days after Russia completed its withdrawal from the north. And according to Ukrainska Pravda, which is a Ukrainian newspaper, Johnson urged Zelensky not to negotiate with Russia. And he said that even if Ukraine was ready to sign a deal with Putin, Kiev's Western backers were not. And the Ukrainska Pravda report said that at the time, Russia was ready for a Putin-Zelensky meeting, but the two factors stopped it from happening. And the two factors were the discovery of dead Ukrainian civilians and Johnson's visit. I always point to these comments from Turkey's foreign minister in April 2022. He said, after the talks in Istanbul, we thought this war was going to end soon. And then there was a NATO summit. And at that NATO summit, he realized that some NATO countries wanted to prolong the war. Why? Because they wanted to weaken Russia. And then just a few days after that, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin admitted that it was one of the U.S.'s goals to weaken Russia. That's why they were supporting Ukraine. Right, the next one here, Putin says that the first Russian nukes have arrived in Belarus. So Putin said this on Friday, that the first batch of Russian tactical nuclear weapons has arrived in Belarus and that the full deployment will be completed by the end of the year. He said that the deployment will serve as a warning. He said, quote, "so that everyone who is thinking about hitting us strategically will not forget about this fact," end quote. When asked about the news on Saturday, President Biden called the deployment irresponsible. Putin has compared the move to NATO's nuclear sharing program, under which there are US B-61 nuclear gravity bombs that are stored in Italy, Germany, Turkey, Belgium, and the Netherlands. When Putin first announced the deployment, he said it was being done in response to the UK providing Ukraine with depleted uranium ammunition, which causes environmental damage and is linked to cancer and birth defects. And the Wall Street Journal just reported last week that the US, it looks like, is also going to arm Ukraine with depleted uranium when the US made Abrams tanks make it over there. So, maybe Russia will respond to that as well in some way. 4 months after canceling his trip to Beijing, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang in the Chinese capital in a push to ease tensions between the two countries that both sides called constructive, and ended with an agreement to continue discussions in Washington. It doesn't seem like, again, ahead of the trip, there was State Department officials saying that, don't expect much. We don't really expect to resolve any issues here. We just want to manage the competition. That's how they're framing it, as a managing of competition. And I know that Qin, from the Chinese side, he said during the meeting apparently that U.S.-China relations are at their lowest point since they were established in 1979. And he's definitely right about that. So the one substantive thing that came out of this was that Blinken invited Qin to Washington. So it looks like he's going to be visiting the U.S. at some point. And now Blinken on Monday is expected to meet with Wang Yi, who is President Xi Jinping's foreign policy advisor. One from Peter Van Buren, the DeSantis torture question at the American Conservative. And that is about DeSantis, who's running for president now. He worked at Gitmo at Guantanamo Bay, and he's never really said much about it. And there's accusations that he was present for torture. And he said that he said himself once that he recommended, the force feeding of prisoners at Gitmo. So, there's just a lot of questions about what he did there exactly. You could always support antiwar.com at antiwar.com/donate. Share the show, tell people about antiwar.com and all that. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Again, World War II is an ancient history. I tell the story of why I own the 3 of the most historic buildings in America. They're right around the corner. I came back from Berlin in 2012. I left on April 17th. 2012, came back on April 27th. And they're showing me around where East Berlin is. And, I'm saying, this place is beautiful. Parks everywhere. No building over 16 stories. I mean, it's beautiful. And I'm having a beer, sitting with the people, looking across the street about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the main drag over there. And I see a beautiful 1880s, maybe, German building. At the same height, all new construction. And I realized everywhere I went, I'd see these beautiful, beautiful German buildings and all new construction, blown out from the war. And Berlin was grander than Paris before it was bombed out. And I'm thinking to myself, in the 1930s, the Germans were at the height of Western civilization, scientifically, culturally, philosophically. I'm thinking of all the great German names, Beethoven, Bach, Wagner. And I'm saying to myself, where were the people? Why didn't you stop this? That's what happened to this country. From that to this, a toilet bowl. Look at the way the people look. Look at the way they dress. I go out to eat, I see guys my age with fucking baseball caps on. Younger guys wear them on backwards. What are you waiting for, a catcher's mask? How about some style and grace? Could you get that one, man? It's gone. If we don't have a Renaissance, what followed the Black Plague? The Renaissance. The people realized they were fucked up. They were killing themselves, so they went back to the past. Alla Romana all'antica, in the manner of the Romans and the ancients, to describe the quality of their work. And look at the fucking shit that they make now. Everything is shit. The furniture's shit. Everything looks like shit. The cars. I remember when cars had style. Every little fucking car looks alike, like a small hearse. No style, all gone. All gone. Because the bigs have taken over everything. There's no choices anymore. When I was a young guy, there were grocery stores, there were hardware stores, there were stationery stores, and now there are grocery chains, hardware chains, drug chains, stationery chains. We've been chained. And we're spending all this fucking money sending kids to school. For what? What does it cost? I think it's like $140,000 from kindergarten to 12 to get so you could drive an Amazon truck or work at a fucking Amazon place? Oh, I think I'll drive a FedEx truck. I think I'll get a job at Walmart. No, I'd rather work at Target. The old days, you had these jobs, and you built yourself up. If we don't turn this around, again, World War II is not ancient history. This is going to be World War III. It's already started. Hey, Frank, give me a gun. Give me a hand grenade. I want to go blow this guy's brains out across the street. Frank gives me the gun and the hand grenade. I blow the guy's brains out. Is Frank an accessory to the crime? This is mission creep like they did in the Vietnam War. Go back to Dwight D. Eisenhower, 5-star general, supreme commander of the Allied forces, and listen to his farewell address, January 17th, 1961. The military-industrial complex is robbing the nation of the genius of the scientists, the sweat of laborers, and the future of the children. This country wasn't supposed to have a huge standing military. It was only to be there if we needed it. The plow makers, then they turned into making, tanks and other stuff. They just changed. It wasn't about a war machine. We have evil, satanic, demonic people in charge. And if we don't rise to a higher level, Jack, you're dead. It's over. And they're taking us there. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Now it's one bad rap. and that fucking stupid beat everywhere I go. Boom, 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 boom. Not an ounce of boogie, not a drop of jive. They killed it. They killed it. The geeks killed it, and the people swallow their shit. I don't carry a cell phone. That's right. One of the only guys around that doesn't carry a cell phone. I did work for the cellular telecommunications industry back in 1994 when they had these boxes and trunks with an aerial. And I read about radio frequency radiation beginning then and keep reading about it now when they publish it. According to the University of California, Berkeley, if you're on a phone for 17 minutes a day for 10 years, your chance of getting a brain tumor only increased by 60%. So anyway, I don't carry it. So I love music and I get my mind off it. And again, I surround myself with beauty. I take care of all these things. Fans sent me this. This is Napoleon's march to Moscow, leaving Poland with 420,000 men and coming back with 10,000. It's a famous chart. You don't beat the Russians. It's very simple as that. Operation Barbarossa by Hitler, they killed about 20 to 25 million. There's a great peace speech by JFK in June of 1963, 5 months before they assassinated him. And he was saying basically the same thing, you don't fight the Russians. And then he says how great the Russians are culturally, scientifically. He said they're good people. And he goes on to say how many of them were killed, and that we share a lot. And then at the close of his speech, Kennedy's speech, again, this is June 1963, 5 months before he's assassinated, he said, America will not go to war. 8 months later, after he was assassinated, took us to war in Vietnam.
Here's President Putin asking, this is really terrifying, Phil, but you can form your own judgment of it. Is the U.S. trying to provoke us?
The Kremlin, there are terrorist attacks organized by Kiev, and of course all those drone attacks, including the Kremlin. On the one hand, the Biden administration is quite categorical in saying that they do not approve of such actions, and they never promoted the destruction of Nord Stream 1 and 2. Can you evaluate it, and how are you going to deal with it? You know, everything you mentioned, these are their attempts to provoke us to some powerful counteractions. The attempt to hit and cause some damage to the Kremlin and all those assaults on the Belgorod region and villages near the border. All these are attempts to provoke us. So if we destroyed 5 Patriot complexes near Kiev, so what do you think? Can we destroy any building in Kiev? There are no limitations for us, but we don't do it due to a number of considerations.
So his argument is the U.S. is trying to provoke us, but we're not going to be provoked. We could be far more destructive of the American vassal state, Ukraine, than we have been. I think he's right on the mark, Phil.
Yeah, I think he is too. And I think he tends to be the only adult in the room. This is scary stuff. I mean, this goes beyond the usual kind of American intervention overseas where you pick on some third world country, beat the hell out of them and sit back and smile. This is dangerous stuff, and nobody seems to get it. We have senators saying things like, well, we are calling for the assassination of Putin. We have other senators saying that he should be removed from power as a condition of negotiations. So, this guy is reading the writing on the wall. It's talking about him, but it's talking about the integrity and the security issues that are fundamental to how Russia sees itself. So, we need a straight talk. I'm still waiting for somebody to explain in simple English exactly why the United States is there at all now.
There are now nuclear weapons in Belarus. Here's President Putin on the significance and purpose of nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons have been created to ensure our security in the widest sense of this word and the existence of the Russian state. But firstly, there's no need for that. And, all these discussions and considerations, they reduce the level, the threshold for using such weapons. And secondly, we have more such weapons than the Western countries. And that is why they move us towards beginning these discussions. No way.
We have more nuclear weapons than the Western countries. Is that true? And is he including Israel?
Well, it's certainly true in terms of the numbers that have been published by the Defense Department in the U.S. And also by international monitors who follow these kinds of issues. But I don't think anyone really knows with any certitude how many actual deployable nuclear weapons the U.S. has or Russia. But it does seem Russia has more of them. And of course, countries like Israel and Pakistan, also nuclear armed, have basically secret programs that have unknown numbers of nukes and ways to deliver them. So this is a mess. The more you mix this up, the stranger it gets. And again, I and maybe the American public, I think increasingly the American public, would like to hear, why the hell is this going on at all?
Phil Giraldi, is Taiwan a legal part of the People's Republic of China?
Yes, it's legally and with the consent of the United States government, part of China, recognized as being part of China. That happened quite some time ago when we normalized our relationship with China. That was one of the conditions. So this debate over Taiwan and how we are going to be defending Taiwan, we'd be defending one province of China against the central government.
So if Taiwan, if the mainland China decides to use military force to compel Taiwan to recognize its own status as a part of mainland China, should we expect the United States to get involved in that conflagration?
I unfortunately would expect us to do it, even though it defies all logic and all reason. Again, this is an issue like Ukraine. I mean, there's no plausible reason and no reason compelling enough to confront China over an issue like this. We have already conceded that that Taiwan is part of China, as was done with Hong Kong some years ago with the British, as you might recall. That eventually transitioned into Hong Kong becoming pretty much fully integrated with mainland China, with all of China, the rest of China. And presumably this is something that may happen down the road with Taiwan. I'm not sure the Taiwanese even want us to go to war on their behalf, particularly if they're watching what's going on in Ukraine.
So unlike Ukraine, to be clear, sir, U.S. forces, U.S. men and women would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
Well, that's terrifying, Phil, but it's about as crystal clear as he's ever been.
Yeah, I mean,
he's talking about troops on the ground. He's not talking about sending howitzers and missiles.
Yeah. Well, one can maybe presume that he's delusional at the moment, making that kind of response. It doesn't make any sense to me, because basically, if you're looking for national security issues that are vital to defend by going to war, this ain't one of them.
Let me ask you this. Does the American intelligence community spy on the president? When Joe and Jill are talking about where are his slippers when he gets up in the morning or when he goes to bed at night, does the American intelligence community hear that?
I would have to suspect they might. That's as far as I can go.
The doctor we want to talk about a little bit is this Dr. Peter Hotez.
Yeah.
And he has a strong opinion about debates. He says, oh, that's below our dignity. We write intellectual papers and we do science. We work on the truth. You know, could anything be further from the truth than that attitude? But anyway, people now have found out that he is not straightforward. He's been challenged by Rogan and others. And there's this thing on that he's been challenged. I guess Rogan maybe started that.
Yeah.
Okay, if you're so smart, why don't you debate Robert Kennedy? You make fun of the guy. Maybe you're doing that because his voice has a difficulty.
Yeah.
Anyway, they figured that they would, move on this. And of course, Ortez, the doctor, who doesn't, what would you expect? He doesn't even believe in debates.
No way.
He says, I'll write a paper on this and explain what the facts are, and we'll work on the truth.
He made Fauci look like a calm person, the most hysterical, pro-mask, pro-vax, pro-isolation, pro-lockdown, everything. Of course, he never suffered from it. But here he is. He's back in the limelight. He was on Joe Rogan's show. We can put up that first, that first clip. And this is from Zero Hedge. Double-talking vaccine scientists refuses to debate RFK Jr. despite $1.5 million charity pot. In fact, that went up to $2.6 million. And if you put the next one on, so here he was on Rogan, and we're going to listen to it in just a second. Joe Rogan first challenged Peter Hotez to debate RFK on the science of vaccines in 2019, but he declined. And here's what he said at the time. He's an attorney and he's very clever and he knows how to do arguments in court. And what am I? I'm a scientist. And let's listen to this clip. Now let's listen to 1 minute and 3 seconds of Rogan talking to Hotez about RFK. And this is where Hotez is trash talking RFK Jr. This is how it started. So that's 1 minute and 3 seconds of this approximately.
Now I know that Robert Kennedy Jr. is he's a big one. He's a big one, and he seems like a very intelligent guy. How could he not be aware of the science behind this, and what is he getting wrong?
What he's getting wrong is just about everything. He's formed an organization called Children's Health Defense, He had a press conference about it. I think it was September, October of last year. It is probably one of the best organized anti-vaccine groups out there. Now, he's doing other things other than vaccine. He's doing a lot of things about environmental health and things like that. I don't know any part of that business. I've only followed what he does with vaccines, but it's all nonsense.
Why is he doing this about vaccines?
I don't know. What's his motive? I mean, you have to ask him what's his motivation.
Would he be a guy that you would want to have a debate with or have a discussion with?
But again, I mean, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of a debate because it's like debating. I don't know. It's like debating a Holocaust denier whether the Holocaust exists. I mean, not that this rises to the
I
same
understand
level,
what you're saying, but if you're again, I want to bring this up.
No. Basically, debating RFK Jr. about vaccines is like debating a Holocaust denier.
Yeah.
That was really goofy stuff, wasn't it?
Well, that's unbelievable, but that's how a demagogue operates.
Yeah.
They think, all you have to mention is get this one word in and appear like you're really intellectual, and you will shift the debate. But I don't think it's going to be that easy because that was only the beginning of the pressure put on him to debate Robert.
And if we put the next clip on, so after that, he had a little hissy fit. If you can put this on, Dr. Hotez did, and he was so mad that Spotify is allowing Joe Rogan to be on its, as one of its podcasters. Spotify has stopped even sort of trying to stem Joe Rogan's vaccine information. It's really true, just awful. And from all the online attacks I'm receiving after this absurd podcast, it's clear many actually believe this nonsense. And so Joe Rogan responded, Peter, if you claim what RFK Jr. is saying is misinformation, I'm offering you $100,000 to the charity of your choice if you're willing to debate him on my show with no time limit. To which Robert F. Kennedy responded, Peter, let's finally have the respectful, congenial, informative debate that the American people deserve. And of course, Hotez declined, saying, as you say, I'm a scientist, I don't debate.
Right. That was just recently come out on a Zero Hedge, and it really annoys me. It's the issue of entrapment. It's been around for a long time, and I got to thinking, how often have we ever seen the government agents, whether it's the CIA, the FBI, the IRS, or some other group in entrapping somebody, encourage them and works with them, bribes them, do all these things. You just don't read the stories. And I think they're more vicious than the people who do it because they're committing the crime. And I think when they're caught in entrapment, they ought to receive the same penalty as the people that they entrapped. But that isn't the case. Matter of fact, I don't think they get punished very often. But the FBI groomed developmentally challenged 16-year-old to become a terrorist and then arrested him. And it's a detailed, a bit complicated. Dollars were engaged, no big money, and all of a sudden they got enough evidence, and then they arrested him. I don't think they have him in prison, but here they make him the monster, and he wouldn't have even existed, without the FBI doing this to him. So that to me is a tragedy, and we should have a tough law on this one, that when you entrap somebody, you get punished for the same disease you got somebody else to commit, and you yourself ought to be fined on top of it all. But unfortunately, sometimes they're seen as heroes because they're going in and they're infiltrating and they find out stuff. Yeah, like January 6th. Yeah, because if they're doing something wrong, well, it'll come out in the evidence in the trial. Yeah, J6 trial. We got to see all that film and realize exactly what the FBI was doing. That is criminal when our government creates the crimes and participates in it. But a lot of people would make the case that government basically is a criminal operation, and when they take money from one group and give it to another, as some have said for many years, that is theft. I mean, you can't do it yourself. Why can you send the government to do all your dirty work for you? That to me is a real tragedy. But the only thing that we can combat that with is just trying to expose the truth to the best of our abilities.
Now let us turn to a philosopher who flourished about 20 years after Heraclitus, about 480 BC, and who represents a diametric opposite viewpoint, Parmenides. Parmenides. Parmenides comes from the town of Elea, E-L-E-A, and so his philosophy is frequently referred to as Eleaticism, or the Eleatic philosophy. Parmenides is the first, judging by the fragments that we have, to support his convictions with reasoned argument. The first, we have a connected whole poem of his extant, and he does not simply announce in Heraclitus' oracular fashion his conclusions, but lets us in on the actual reasoning that he adopted. He is profoundly opposed to Heraclitus' view, to the view that everything is an identity of opposites, or that nothing is, everything is becoming. His entire philosophy derives from one basic principle, which I will give you in my own words, but the substance of it is his principle. What is, and what is not, is not. And what is not can neither be nor be thought about. I'll repeat that because that is the essence of Parmenides. What is, and what is not, and what is not can neither be nor be thought about. Now, if you want to hear Parmenides' own formulations of this, I'll quote you from some of his fragments. Quote from Parmenides. Come now, I will tell thee, and do thou hearken to my saying, and carry it away. The only two ways of search that can be thought of. The first, namely, that what is, and that it is impossible for it not to be, is the way of belief, for truth is its companion. The other, namely, that what is not, that I tell thee is a path that none can learn of at all. For thou canst not know what is not. That is impossible, nor utter it. Unquote. Now, as you gather, that is an unmitigated repudiation of Heraclitus. Heraclitus says everything is and isn't. And Parmenides says absolutely not. If it is, it is, and if it isn't, it isn't. What is, and what isn't, isn't. In regard to the Heracliteans, he has very pointed words. He refers to them in one fragment, quote, as mortals knowing not who wander two-faced. Helplessness guides the wandering thought in their breasts, and they are borne along stupefied like men deaf and blind. Undiscerning crowds who hold that it is and is not the same and not the same, and that all things travel in opposite directions, unquote. In other words, out with the Heracliteans. And one more fragment from him. For this shall never be proved, that the things that are not are. And do thou restrain thy thought from this way of inquiry, unquote. Now, what does it mean, his basic principle? Well, it is, of course, the earliest formulation in the history of thought of what Ayn Rand in Galt's speech formulates as existence exists, and its meaning is the same. And therefore, it includes the following elements. First, there is a reality, which he refers to as what is, that which exists. Reality exists, and only reality exists. What is, and only what is. What is not, is not. And another point implicit. What is not can never be thought about. In other words, all thought must be thought about existence, about what is. It is impossible, according to Parmenides, ever to think about what is not, or to know what is not, or to have any cognitive relation of any kind to what is not. Now, if you doubt this, perform a mental experiment right now. Try. I want you for a second to think about nothing. Now, I don't mean the letters N-O-T-H, because that's something. And I don't mean a black wall, that's something. I mean nothing. Absolutely nothing. What is not? Okay, go ahead and have a thought. Now, you see, you cannot do it, because as soon as you think about something. You think about what is. And thus, Parmenides' famous line, thou canst not know nor utter what is not. It is simply empty. There is no what is not, and therefore you can't think about it. And this, of course, is the view that ultimately appears in Galt's speech as in the full developed philosophy as the view that consciousness is the faculty of perceiving that which exists. In this sense, the earliest source of these crucial ideas are Parmenides. And he is therefore an extremely important, and in this respect, an extremely good philosopher. We can put his viewpoint another way in order to prepare ourselves for the consequences that he derived from it. If thought is always about reality, always about what is, then it is untenable and invalid ever to hold a concept of sheer non-existence. In other words, of what is not. Because that would be a concept of nothing. In other words, it would be no concept. His key point in this respect is, to put it in a sort of funny way, but this is really the essence of it, there is no nothing. There is only some things. And the thought about nothing is therefore not a thought about anything. It's not a thought at all. All concepts must be formed within existence and refer to existence. And therefore, any theory or any philosophic position which at any point requires a concept of sheer nothing, of non-existence, according to Parmenides, is invalid on that grounds and must be dismissed right away.
As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Next one here, Blinken meets with Chinese President Xi in Beijing. So this article is from the South China Morning Post. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's landmark trip to China ended on Monday with a commitment from both countries to try to stabilize ties to prevent their intensifying rivalry from descending into conflict. So the closely watched two-day visit wrapped up with a meeting between Blinken and Chinese President Xi Jinping, who told the visiting diplomat that the world needed a stable U.S.-China relationship and that the two countries should handle ties with a sense of responsibility. She said, quote, whether China and the U.S. can get along correctly has a bearing on the future and the destiny of humankind, end quote. So she told Blinken that the rivalry between great powers could not solve problems in the United States or challenges facing the world, and the two powers should seek to respect each other's interests. He said, quote, China respects the interests of the United States and will not challenge or replace the United States. Similarly, the United States must also respect China and not harm China's legitimate interests and rights. Neither party can shape the other according to its own wishes, let alone deprive the other of its legitimate right to development, end quote. So the Chinese leader said that countries around the world had aired concerns over worsening U.S.-China ties. And another thing, that was made clear to Blinken while he was there in all the meetings with Wang Yi, who's Xi's top foreign policy advisor, and Qin Gang, who's the Chinese foreign minister, they all said, Taiwan is a red line is basically what they told him. And, while Blinken was there, he did a press conference, and Blinken said that the U.S. does not support Taiwanese independence, which is, longstanding U.S. policy going back decades. That's nothing new. That's been every administration's policy since, 1979, at least, when it was formalized. But that clip went viral online, and, all these stupid people that don't understand, the U.S.-China relationship and the situation over Taiwan, saying that Blinken was, capitulating to the Chinese or that he gave them the green light to invade Taiwan, just complete nonsense. I was just surprised how many people don't know anything about this policy and are ready to get all whipped up into a frenzy about Taiwan. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Monday that NATO will not offer a formal invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance at the upcoming summit in Vilnius that will be held from July 11th to the 12th. Next one, the last news story here, the FBI groomed a 16-year-old to become a terrorist. So this is from The Intercept. And this is a story about how the FBI groomed a 16-year-old with brain development issues to become a terrorist. So basically, this 16-year-old, well, actually, he's 18. He was just arrested. Matteo Ventura, he was from Wakefield, Massachusetts. And he had brain development issues. He was bullied in school and he was homeschooled. And an FBI agent befriended him on the internet and got him to send him money, very small amounts of money. They said that he was sending him gift cards worth $25. And they were trying to get him to agree to travel to the Islamic State, I guess, go to Syria or Iraq, wherever, they even really have a foothold now. And, according to this Intercept report, he was making excuses for not going, and they still arrested him. And they said there was a hint that he appeared to be ready to turn in his purported ISIS contact to the FBI. So just complete entrapment for this poor kid, who's now arrested and could face prison time for being a terrorist. But there's so many cases like this. The FBI has done this so much since 9/11. This just seems to be a real blatant example of the kind of things that they do.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Okay, so here's the deal. Summertime's coming. People are going to be spending more. There's going to be more tourism. They're going to go out and travel. Things are going to be taking it easy for a while. It happens all the time. Then comes September. Then you start looking at how much stuff the retailers bought for the holiday season coming up. Then you start looking at the reality of why the equity markets have gone up. Only a handful of companies are driving up the NASDAQ. And then the reality sets in. And that's why your crashes happen in October and in March. March, it's after the holidays. And October's after the summer holidays. So there's going to be a flattening out. Again, the S&P 500 is up over 12%, just as we had forecast. And it's nearing its peak. Gold prices went down because the dollar went up, because the talk is they're going to raise interest rates 2 more times. But are they really going to? Because all they ever say is bullshit. Yep. This is the guy that said inflation was temporary and transitory. And then you read the headline story and Yellen screaming it out as well. How can anybody believe the shit coming out of these people's fucking mouth? How the fuck can you believe them? What the fuck is wrong with you? I believe my kindergarten teacher. I believe I believe the principal of the school. I believe the politicians. I'm a Democrat. I'm a repulsive king. I look up to Mitch McConnell. Oh, no. I like Chucky Schumer. How about that Katson Macron with the fake hair? True dope. The daddy's boy up in Canada. One little fucking freak after another. This thing's going to go down big. It's going to go down hard, and it's going to go down fast. So, yeah, gold prices are down because the dollar's up, because they're talking about raising interest rates again. And that's the only reason the dollar's strong. And then over there in the UK on Thursday, they may raise interest rates another 25 basis points. Inflation's over 8%. And the same thing in the EU. They raised interest rates last week, but the interest rates are way below the inflation rate. It's still negative interest rates. So this is all temporary. But don't worry, when all else fails, they take you to war.
Does the intelligence community, CIA or any other aspect of it, surveil the president and his wife?
Not officially. So number one, you would have intercepted communications. Well, every presidential phone call is already recorded, intercepted by the communications, White House communications office. So, that's collected. What you get is the informal banter based on briefers, what they've seen. They go back and we'll talk about it, but that's not, to my knowledge, that's never been formally written up. What you don't have is actual units investigating, saying, okay, let's delve into, in this case, Joe Biden's contacts with these Ukrainians, and let's see what we can uncover. They get that information in the course of doing work on Ukraine. They may come across and say, oh my goodness, we've got some uncomfortable ties here, relationships with the president.
So if he gets out of bed in the morning and he can't find his slippers, and he asks Jill to help him find his slippers, that's not going to be picked up by CIA surveillance. In the White House, that's not going to be picked up by CIA surveillance. Okay.
Now, the White House clued in.
Say again?
So the White House are clued in and would comment on that, but not the CIA.
Okay. I remember one of my last conversations with President Trump when he was in the White House. We were talking about pardons, and he was asking my opinion on people he was about to pardon and commute sentences for. And then I reminded him, you're leaving in a couple of weeks, and we had a small talk. And then I reminded him that he promised the American public and me personally in private that he would, while still president, release the JFK files. And he said, no, I can't do it. If they had shown you what they showed me, you wouldn't release it either. What did they show you, and who showed it to you? Now, here's the part of the conversation I want to recount to you. Judge, someday when we're together and 15 people aren't listening to our phone call, I'll tell you what they showed me. Well, now, what does he mean, 15? It may have been his way of speaking. Maybe it's 20, maybe it's 2. But what does he mean, 15 people listening to his phone call? He was calling from the Oval Office.
Right. So you remember when the first impeachment of Trump, when Vindman came forward and the transcript of his conversation, that's what he's talking about. That is recorded by elements of the Department of Defense. They fall under military chain of command. And so every communication is recorded now. It goes back. There was a period, 60, 70 years ago when the conversations weren't recorded, but that's not the case now. Technology has made it available, so they do get all of that recorded.
Okay. How about his cell phone? He used to call me from his cell phone. Would that be recorded? He's in the back of the Beast, the presidential limo. That's recorded too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. What is the status of the Ukraine offensive as of today, June 20th?
If you could compare, it was promised to be delivered like a Hollywood blockbuster. It'd be to set the world on fire. It's been a flop at the box office. But in this case, what we're talking about, it's been a flop because you've got literally more than 10,000 Ukrainian troops dead, and they have not advanced even to the first line of defense.
We need a peace president. Most people agree that we are closer to nuclear war than at any time since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Some would even argue that we are closer now than we were in those fateful days when Soviet missiles in Cuba almost triggered a nuclear war between the U.S. and the USSR. In those days, we were told that we were in a life or death struggle with communism and thus could not cede a square foot of territory, or the dominoes would fall one by one until the Reds ruled over us. That crisis was very real to me as I was drafted into the military in the middle of the USSR standoff over Cuba, and we could all feel how close we were to annihilation. Fortunately, we had a president in the White House at the time who understood the dangers of nuclear brinksmanship. Even though he was surrounded by hawks who could never forgive him for aborting the idiotic Bay of Pigs Cuban invasion, President John F. Kennedy picked up the telephone for a discussion with his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, which eventually saved the world. Historians now tell us that President Kennedy agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviets removing missiles from Cuba. It was a classic case of how diplomacy can work if properly employed. It's all too clear that we do not have a John F. Kennedy in the White House today. Although we no longer face a Soviet empire and a communist ideology as justification for taking a confrontational tone toward Russia, the Biden administration is still dragging the U.S. toward a nuclear conflict. Why are they putting us all at risk? The same old domino theory that was discredited in the Cold War? If we don't fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian, Putin will soon be marching through Berlin. This all started with Biden's promising to only send uniforms and medical supplies to Ukraine for fear of sparking a Russian retaliation. From there, we went to anti-tank missiles, multiple rocket launchers, Patriot missiles, Bradley fighting vehicles, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The Biden administration announced last week that it would send depleted uranium ammunition to Ukraine, which poisons the earth for millennia to come. Rumors are that long-range missiles are to be delivered soon, which could strike deep into Russia. Apparently, F-16 fighter jets are also on the way. The escalation rationale from Washington, we are told, is that since the Russians have not directly retaliated against NATO for NATO's direct support of Ukraine's war machine, we can be sure they never will respond. Is that really a wise bet? It is clear to many that U.S.-built F-16 fighters taking off from NATO bases with NATO pilots attacking Russians in Ukraine, or even Russia itself, would be a declaration of war on Russia. That means World War III, something we managed to avoid for the whole Cold War. Congress is silent or compliant as we lurch forward toward disaster for no discernible U.S. strategic goal. Biden, or whoever is actually running the government, is forging straight ahead. As we move into the U.S. presidential election cycle, one thing is clear. We desperately need a peace president to do for us what JFK did for the U.S. during the Cuba crisis. Hopefully, it won't be too late. Thanks for listening.
We can put that up. To resolve tax issues, gun charge. Just made a little plea deal, no big deal. Zero Heads wrote it up. We can look at the next one. This is basically the meat of what's going on here. Hunter, 53, is now expected to plead guilty of 2 misdemeanor tax charges of failure to pay 2017 and 2018 combined tax liability of roughly $1.2 million. He'll also admit to illegally possessing a weapon after his 2018 purchase of a handgun, which will likely result in a diversion program, which would result in the removal of the gun charge if the program's conditions are met. In total, he'll likely receive 2 years probation for diversion conditions. Now, you mentioned Trump in your opening statement. It really is hard, and maybe we're biased, I don't know, I don't think we are. It's hard to look at what Trump faces. 400 years in prison for a few documents to Biden for these things, as we know, the tip of the iceberg, facing just literally a slap on the wrist.
And once again, the people involved, like say with January 6th, I mean, we had intense hearings about this, but any evidence that might have given a fair balance on who did what there, that was excluded. And people more and more will become knowing it was nothing more but a cover up there and made use of. But the deal that they made is something that might still. The deal itself, people who are knowledgeable will know that's a negative. They won't see that as a negative. But maybe there's some others who just barely look at that and say, aha, he was guilty. Yeah. And he didn't pay his taxes or something like that. So there'll be some people that'll, because this is big news right now, there's still a few people out here that could care less about this whole thing. And some days I wished I could care less about it too. But it's just the stuff that goes on where it's realized by more and more people this is not equal justice.
Some of the things that are not involved are the alleged payments, and this is from Zero Hedge. Spoiler, none of the charges involves Hunter's role as an international bagman for the Biden family, alleged of course, which included a $10 million payment from Burisma to Hunter and Joe Biden, according to the FBI source. And go to the next one, here's some further clarification of how it came to be that we're not talking about this. The federal investigation into Hunter Biden began in 2018 and initially centered around Hunter Biden's finances related to overseas business ties and consulting work. Over time, and I've highlighted this part, over time, the international business dealings were dropped from the investigation, perhaps due to Joe Biden's alleged involvement, and the focus shifted to Hunter's failure to report his income, as well as lying on the paperwork to purchase a gun in 2018, possibly. So these things just sort of quietly went away. The Justice Department was asked whether they're still looking into it. They said, yes, it's still under investigation, so don't hold your breath. But here's what they're not talking about, and this came out a few days ago. This is a top Republican on the Justice Committee, I think. If you put this next one, this is from the Daily Mail, and this is something that's probably a lot more important than buying a gun and not paying the taxes. Top Republican James Comer says new Biden bank records will show that the family accepted between $20 and $30 million from foreign nationals. He's the Oversight Committee chair. Sorry, I stand corrected. But he's claiming that through this whistleblower and through their own investigations, they're seeing $20 to $30 million in their bank accounts through these different shell companies that have benefited the Bidens. So this is the containment. They want to contain this, so they'll admit to the tax stuff, I think.
Yes, maybe they can simplify this and say, "Oh, you're a bunch of crybabies just because Trump couldn't hire a good attorney." But Biden got some good attorneys. But I think there's another factor way through that whole. I don't think the attorneys probably they were around, but the ones who were making the wheeling and dealing weren't the average attorney that goes to represent these people. But Trump has had his trouble with attorneys and things like this.
And employees. The U.S. has basically kicked Cuba in the face for 60 years, done everything we could to try to destroy, to try to kill the leaders, all kinds of crazy stuff for 60 years. And now he put up this next clip. By doing this, we've isolated Cuba. Cuba doesn't look to the U.S. as an ally or a friend or even someone to negotiate with. If you can put this next note. And this really underscores the failure of U.S. diplomacy, which is always one-sided. This is from the Wall Street Journal article. Discussions for the facility on Cuba's northern coast are at an advanced stage but not concluded, U.S. intelligence reports suggest. The Biden administration has contacted Cuban officials to try to forestall the deal. Again, after 60 years of kicking them in the face. Do they really think that a phone call saying, hey guys, don't let the Chinese in, we mean it? You think that Cuba's going to say, oh, you've been so nice to us, okay, that's a deal. They're going to say, no, we want the Chinese. We want to have a tough big brother as our ally here to protect us. So it really is a failure of the entire U.S. approach to the rest of the world, I think.
Yeah, well, it is a big deal as far as I'm concerned, and this is not going to be resolved with maybe sending our top diplomat over there.
Anthony.
Maybe we just need more diplomats. Like I used to sort of kid and say, we have some umpteen number of diplomats, a lot of them. Why don't we ever use them? Because I think they've lost the whole notion of what a diplomat. A diplomat is nothing more than somebody who promotes their own set of standards and their own laws. But that's the whole thing is the CIA too. The CIA are essentially in the embassies around the world. And I had somebody in the family that was not a close family member, but was worked in an embassy, and he verified. He says any embassy I've ever been in, you learn who the CIA agents are. They have them there. Getting information and helping us be safe.
Helping democracy. You guys like it, I'm sure that the distance is not lost on the Chinese. But you mentioned sending our top diplomat over to China. Well, we did that. We did that this week and skip ahead to that tweet from Stephen Roach. which is interesting because Blinken's long delayed trip to China finally took place. This is him speaking with the Chinese foreign minister, but he had a very short meeting. And this is Stephen Roach, who wrote by diplomatic drive-by. Blinken and Xi met only for 35 minutes, one of the shortest high-level meetings on record. Consecutive translation cuts the exchange in half, leaving less than 10 minutes of perfunctory speaking time. It was a very short trip. Blinken, as usual, looked like he had a case of indigestion, which is possible. You never know. But here's what happened if you look at the next one. This is from our friends over at Moon of Alabama. They point out that Blinken walked out of his meeting with Xi. It seemed like someone read him the riot act. He did not look happy. And here's what he said. He said, the United States will not support Taiwan breaking away from China. Amid a series of confusing statements by Biden on the issue. We do not support Taiwan independence, America's top diplomat said in Beijing after meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. If you remember, Biden said a few times, we're going to defend Taiwan, we're going to defend Taiwan. The rhetoric has been escalating and escalating, and all of a sudden, he walks out of a couple-minute meeting with Xi and says, no, we're not going to do that.
We should refer to the meeting as a low-level meeting, a diplomatic meeting, because they've diminished themselves as far as importance goes. But, you know, it still should strike more Americans and ask the question, why are we over there? You know, provoking and looking for trouble. And that's not like in the neighborhood. It's not like the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
But China might want the Gulf of Mexico to be like the South China Sea, and there's a lot of waterways that are very close to a lot of the United States. Oh, we wouldn't tolerate that for a minute, and yet here we are. We've done this for years, but it's way back. You said 60 years. It's been back as long as our country has existed. That we have been involved and had a little war over it too.
Yeah.
So that to me is a real pity, because I think if a country had a foreign policy where the principle would be mind our own business. That's what we do with our neighbors at home. You mind your own business and stay out of trouble. And how do you stay with friends with people that you might disagree with for various reasons? Just avoid it. Don't try to reform everybody you run into. That leads to trouble. But that's what happens to an empire. I think what we're witnessing now is the beginning of the end of the American empire, the end of the American reserve currency, the dollar reserve currency of the world, and also the empire that's going to end will cause a lot of ramifications. This stuff will get sorted out. You know, if there's chaos that we hope and pray we can help, cancel that out and not have it. You can imagine if local people had been allowed, just because nobody had the strength or the energy and the money to interfere in Ukraine. Maybe the Russian-speaking Ukrainians and the others that were European-speaking people, maybe they would have gotten together.
Yeah.
It would be more likely, because they would both have an interest. Now it's international, it's NATO, it's the United States, it's the military-industrial complex, on, and then it builds. The descent builds. Look at we try to explain at least where the Russians are coming from, not to identify with their policies as much as where they're coming from, and they have every reason to say that they can justify morally that when NATO moves up to their boundaries, they're up to no good.
Now, on this basis, Parmenides drew a number of systematic deductions. Here they are. Number one, the universe must be uncreated. Could never have come into existence. Why? Well, if there was an origin, a beginning to what is, then what existed before? Well, if it wasn't what is, it had to be what is not. But what is not is not. There is no nothing. And therefore, there could never have been a state of nothing preceding the state of something. In other words, the universe must always have existed. It could not have been created. So much for the religious view. Now, I may say that on the basis of this reasoning, no Greek philosopher ever believed the universe was created out of nothing. That is a distinctively and exclusively Jewish Christian doctrine, never accepted by the most mystical Greeks on the basis of Parmenides' principle. Secondly, in the other direction, the universe must be indestructible. It could never go out of existence, because if it went out of existence, meaning by the universe, of course, everything which is, what would be left? What is not. But what is not and can never be. And therefore, the universe must be indestructible. It always will exist. Now, if you put these 2 points together, we can say that according to Parmenides, the universe is therefore eternal. It has no beginning and no end. Third point, focusing now within the universe. Can there be such a thing as a vacuum, as an empty space, completely empty now, a real little zero inside the physical world? To which Parmenides answers, absolutely not. What is not is not. All there is what is, and therefore there's no such thing as a real vacuum. As this was later came to be expressed in Latin, the universe is a plenum, P-L-E-N-U-M, which means it is solidly packed. The actual word means full. It's completely full. There's no little holes in it, no little spaces, no little nothings. It's one big slab of stuff. Huge ball of tightly packed matter. Now, for other reasons which are irrelevant, he happened to believe that it had the shape of a sphere, apparently because he thought there was no good reason why it should bulge in one direction and not the other. But that's beside the point. Well, so far, we've given you several of his deductions. His principle, what is really the basic law of logic, and in that sense he's sometimes called the father of logic. Although that's pretty indirect, because he didn't know that it had anything to do with thinking, as a principle of guiding thinking. He certainly launched an all-out attack on Heraclitus and raised hell with religion. So he's made a good start. But Parmenides drew another deduction from his basic principle, which in his opinion was just as obvious as all the preceding ones. And that's where all the trouble comes in. He drew as a fourth conclusion the idea that change is impossible. Change of any kind. Motion, alteration, occurrence of any kind. Therefore, according to his viewpoint, there is no such thing as talking, moving, writing, swimming, planets orbiting the sun. All of that is a gigantic illusion. Now, why? How did he draw such a conclusion? Well, take a simple example of change, and to vary it, I won't make it to match. Let's take a seed growing into a flower. Now, at the beginning of the change, the seed represents what is. What about the flower at the beginning? Flower is not. At the end of the change, what happened to the seed? It's gone. It's what is not. What happened to the flower? Well, of course, it's now there. It's what is. And that, of course, is true in every change. Something goes away and something comes to be. What does it mean then? Change is a double violation, he concluded, of his principle. Every change is a simultaneous passage from what is to what is not, and from the other aspect, from what is not to what is. But there is no what is not, and you can't think about what is not, and therefore, out. Change, according to him, is just as irrational as the idea of the universe being created or going out of existence. It involves reference to what is not, and what is not is not. Therefore, he concluded, there is no change at all. The world is completely motionless in every respect. Now, you see here that there is a sense in which he is in complete agreement with Heraclitus. Both of them agree with the following crucial viewpoint. Change implies a contradiction. Change implies a violation of logic. Heraclitus, from the aspect that at the end of the change the thing is and isn't what it was, and Parmenides from the aspect that at the end of the change you have what is not becoming what is and vice versa, and that's a contradiction since what is not is not. Now, given this common premise, they of course take diametrically opposite views. Heraclitus says, change is obvious, therefore to hell with logic. Parmenides says, logic is obvious, therefore to hell with change. But the common denominator is you have to make your choice. It's either logic or change, either identity or change.
The time has come for us to get together by the tens of thousands. At one time, in one place, we will rise up and let our voice be heard for freedom, peace, and prosperity. Brothers and sisters, let freedom ring.
Once upon a time, Washington, D.C., wise man with a silver tongue encouraged us to see from Stone Mountain, Georgia, to Lookout, Tennessee. From the snow-capped Rocky Mountains, he cried, let freedom ring, let freedom ring! Down the streets of New York City, let freedom ring! From the big wide open skies of Montana, let freedom ring! Across the 1,000 shiny lakes in Minnesota, let freedom ring! From the dusty desert roads in Arizona, across the river, and we said show me the way. And we walked across the river, and we stumbled to the sea, and we jumped right in like lemmings, cried to Uncle Sam, oh please save me. Then one September day when we thought everything was well, a tiger in a cage got loose and the fear began to swell. A little bearded man decided to take euros for his oil. That made the big fat banker's dark blue blood begin to boil. It rained hell along the rivers, and we shot missiles from the sea, and we waved our flags and shouted, you know they hate us just because we're free. So here we are today, Washington, D.C. A wise man with a golden heart encourages us to see we've come so far so fast, we've begun to see the light. Battle will be long and hard, but we won't give up the fight. And we'll march along the river, and we'll sail across the sea, and we'll climb every mountain, cry out from the top, let freedom ring. Let freedom ring down the streets of New York City. Let freedom ring from the big wide open skies of Montana. Let freedom ring across the 1,000 shiny lakes in Minnesota. Let freedom ring from the dusty desert roads in Arizona. Let freedom ring around the world. Let freedom ring for boys and girls. Let freedom ring for our troops. Let freedom ring, we'll never lose. Let freedom ring for Dr. Paul. Let freedom ring for one and all. Let freedom ring. 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 Let freedom
More and more begin to know the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the U.S. weapons maker Lockheed Martin says that it is standing by to help Ukrainians fly and maintain F-16 fighter jets once NATO countries finalize their plans to provide Kiev with the aircraft. So Lockheed Martin is also ready to manufacture more F-16s to backfill the stockpiles of countries that ship their jets to Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has been a boon for Lockheed Martin as they make many of the weapon systems being poured into the conflict zone, including the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which is a big one. You know, they've sent thousands and thousands of them, I think 10,000 of those into Ukraine. And they also make the HIMARS rocket systems, which is also another big one. So this is Ukraine's ambassador to NATO. She told Politico that Kiev seeks some kind of invitation or at least a commitment to look at the time frame of their membership. She said that they're being realistic. They're not pushing to get membership right now, but they want some kind of commitment for when the war is over. But right now, you know, there's no end to this conflict in sight, and such a commitment to Ukraine, as we know, as we're always covering, you know, Russia's main thing, their main demand in the negotiations, and one of their biggest motives for invading Ukraine was Ukraine's alignment with NATO, was Ukrainian neutrality is what they want. So if NATO says, okay, once this war is over, then you can become a NATO member, you know, as long as Russia can keep fighting this funding and fighting this war. That's as long as it's going to go. This is their thing. This is the main thing. This is what this is all about. So any kind of promise like that, I mean, it just guarantees war for, a long time. All right. So the next one here, President Biden says that the threat of Putin using nukes is real. So President Biden said this on Monday, that the threat of Russian President Vladimir Putin using tactical nuclear weapons is real. And he made these comments to donors during a trip to California. And President Biden has previously recognized that the policy of the U.S. and NATO backing Ukraine against Russia risks nuclear war. In October 2022, he said that the chances of nuclear Armageddon were higher than at any point since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So despite recognizing that, he hasn't done anything to ease tensions since warning, of nuclear Armageddon. I remember at the time I thought, oh, maybe this is a good sign because it shows he actually realizes the risks here. Maybe he's going to cool things down. But no, he's done nothing to ease tensions and continues to escalate U.S. involvement in the war, most recently by giving the okay for the F-16s. And Biden administration officials have also repeatedly expressed support for Ukrainian attacks on Crimea using U.S.-made weapons, and they're shrugging off these Ukrainian attacks inside Russia. There's a recent New York Times report that said earlier in the war, the Biden administration was worried that Ukrainian attacks in Russia could escalate the war. They were worried about Putin using a tactical nuke. Now they're not as worried. Apparently Biden, thinks it's a real threat, though, but he's not going to do anything to change that. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said on Tuesday that the Russian military has information that shows Ukraine is plotting to attack Crimea with U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems and British-provided Storm Shadow cruise missiles. So Shoigu said, quote, according to our data, the leadership of the Ukrainian armed forces is planning to deliver strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation, including Crimea, with HIMARS and Storm Shadow missiles, end quote. So Shoigu warned that such strikes would make the U.S. and Britain direct parties to the conflict and warned of a potential response. He said, quote, the use of these missiles outside the zone of our special military operation would mean that the United States and Britain would be fully dragged into the conflict and would entail immediate strikes on decision-making centers in Ukraine, end quote. So while the Biden administration has said that it does not want Ukraine using U.S.-provided weapons on Russian territory, the restriction does not apply to Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014, and the people that live there want to be part of Russia. They're not asking to be liberated by the Ukrainians. They want to stay in Russia. So if the claims about the training facility are true, Beijing's efforts would clearly be a response to the U.S. building up militarily in areas near China. And this is something that the Wall Street Journal report recognized. The report said, quote, U.S. intelligence officials say that Beijing sees its actions in Cuba as a geographical response to the U.S. relationship with Taiwan. The U.S. invests heavily in arming and training the self-governing island that sits off mainland China and that Beijing sees as its own, end quote. So Taiwan is roughly 100 miles from the coast of mainland China, which is about the same distance Cuba is from Florida. So this report, I want to read the quote just because it's interesting, to see the Wall Street Journal actually including this. It said, quote, China has no combat forces in Latin America, according to U.S. officials. Meanwhile, the U.S. has dozens of military bases throughout the Pacific, where it stations more than 350,000 troops, end quote. So, the Pacific is a pretty broad region, but still the U.S. has a major military presence near China, and China has nothing comparable to that near the U.S. So, of course, all the China hawks are in a frenzy over this again. So she said that if the present state of U.S. discourse continued, China would probably never agree to resume military-to-military communications. And these are channels that China suspended after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. So her trip, her reckless, trip for a photo op, it sparked the largest ever Chinese military drills around Taiwan. And we're, the effects of it are still being felt now as China has kept up the military pressure on Taiwan and, has kept these dialogues suspended. So I think it's interesting. And, that's kind of what I've been thinking is that all the U.S. is saying is, oh, we want to talk. We want to talk. We got to talk. Talking's good, right? Which I agree. Talking is good. It's good that there is dialogue at least happening at some levels, but they're not talking about really changing things or resolving issues between the two sides. So Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan met with his Iranian counterpart in Tehran on Saturday and signaled that Riyadh is open to a naval alliance with Tehran, an idea that was recently put forward by Iran's Navy chief. So Prince Faisal said at a joint press conference with Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian, Faisal said, quote, I would like to point out the importance of cooperation between our two countries concerning the regional security, especially the security of maritime navigation and waterways, end quote. So Iran's Navy commander said earlier this month that Iran was working to form a naval alliance with regional countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Iraq. So the potential maritime coalition goes against U.S. and Israeli plans for the region. They want to form an anti-Iran alliance between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. But this Iran-Saudi normalization really got in the way of things here. Iran's foreign minister said that that he discussed with Faisal increasing cooperation in all areas, including security, and he stressed Iran's view that regional security will be ensured by regional actors only without external interference, and that is a clear reference to the U.S. And this increased cooperation, of course, comes after this surprise China-brokered normalization deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Faisal said, quote, "Our relations are based on a clear foundation of full and mutual respect for independence, sovereignty, and non-interference in internal affairs," end quote.
The Peter Schiff Show.
And just think about what will happen. Let's say interest rates just stay around 5%. I think they're headed higher, even if they dip a little bit first. I think 5% is going to look low at some point. But let's just say rates stay around 5%. The national debt is going to be 40 trillion in a few more years, right? Not that many. At 5%, because by the time the national debt is 40 trillion, the whole thing would have rolled over. There'll be no more of that 25 basis point debt on the Fed's balance sheet or on the government's balance sheet anymore. It'll all be gone. So if you figure the government ends up paying 5% on a $40 trillion national debt, that's $2 trillion a year in interest. That is more than triple the current $600 billion. That's more than we spend on Medicaid right now. That's more than we spend on Social Security. It's actually about what we spend on Social Security and national defense combined. And that's just interest. That's $2 trillion. But another very troubling fact should be that even if we could balance the budget without interest, meaning that the government collected enough in taxes to pay its bills, not counting interest, even if the government could do that, we would still have a deficit of $2 trillion a year, which it can't. If you look right now, federal tax revenue is about 4.7 trillion. Spending is 6.3 trillion. Even if you subtract the 600 billion for interest on the national debt, you still have an operating deficit of $1 trillion. Even if there was no national debt and no interest to pay, we still have $1 trillion deficit, budget deficit every year, adding to the national debt. So that means if the government can maintain that $1 trillion deficit, which I doubt it can do, it's about to skyrocket as the economy, collapses into recession, or a deeper recession than what we got now. But even if we can maintain that, that means when interest on the debt is $2 trillion, the annual budget deficits will be $3 trillion a year. I mean, this is, going ballistic. Clearly, an accident is about to happen. We cannot continue this. And so this is a fiscal powder keg. All it needs is a fuse, and it's going to go off. And I think it's got to be this next downturn that is coming. I mean, the global economy, everybody is feeling the impact of rising interest rates. Right? We're in like the lull before the storm. Although there was news over the weekend out of China, the Chinese economy growth is slowing, unemployment is picking up. In fact, they even had some rate cuts already in China, right, to try to stimulate the economy. Right, this is just the beginning. But these problems are worldwide because of 12 years of artificially low interest rates and the malinvestments and bubbles and debt that were a byproduct of that era. As rates have been allowed to rise, all of those mistakes are rising to the surface, and we're just beginning to experience the consequences. And when you look at what just happened with the deficit and the suspension of the debt ceiling, the creditors are figuring this out. The de-dollarization is not just about the sanctions on Russia. It's also about the enormity of the debt and the fact that our creditors want out. They don't want to be aboard this ship when it sinks. A lot of people are under the false impression, due to revisionist history, that America was like, last to the, abolishing slavery party, that we were dragging our feet and every other country abolished slavery and we were like one of the last to do it. And that's just not true. I mean, Americans were leading the charge to abolish slavery. I mean, even going back to before the birth of the nation, while we were still colonies, there was a lot of movement. In fact, the state of Vermont, and before it was a state, it was just a territory. abolished slavery in 1777. So that was before we had the United States. It was a territory, and they abolished slavery. And of course, a lot of the delegates to the convention that voted for independence, a lot of those guys would have liked to have abolished slavery. They just didn't have enough support because they needed the support of the southern states, and slavery was important to the southern states. And so in order to have a unified Declaration of Independence from the Crown, they had to put those anti-slavery concerns on the back burner. But that doesn't mean they didn't have them, because they did. But also, I mentioned that Vermont abolished slavery in 1777, but Pennsylvania did it in 1780. New Hampshire and Massachusetts in 1783. Connecticut, my state that I'm in now, and Rhode Island in 1784. New Jersey in 1804, and New York in 1817. Britain didn't abolish slavery until 1833. And all these people on Twitter are saying, oh, Great Britain was 1833, and we waited until 1863 or 1865. That's the entire United States. That's not individual states, because back in those days, the states had a lot more sovereignty than they do today. We really were United Nation states, united under a common federal government, but the state government was far more important. The nature of the country is very different. And so it was very significant that you had individual states abolishing slavery. I mean, when America was first formed, it was a little bit more like the European Union. Yes, if you're French, if you're Italian, if you're German, you're in the EU, but you still identify more with your country than the European Union. And that was what it was like prior to the Civil War. And so to ignore the fact that these states were leading the charge in abolishing slavery. France didn't abolish it until 1848. What took them so long?
The First Amendment, I think, is founded on truth. The Establishment Clause, which actually prevents the establishment of a single religion in the United States, was all about actually protecting, instead, paving the way for free speech and open debate, also included in the First Amendment. So I think part of this is woven into our Constitution because it's a theory about the pursuit of truth itself. The path to truth runs through free speech and open debate. That's how we do it on Earth. In a divine kingdom of heaven, it may reveal itself in a different way, but on Earth, when we live in the world that you and I live in currently, Dr. Paul, we sort that out. The last best path that we have to get there is free speech and open debate. And I think that is enshrined in our Constitution. And so in many ways, that's what motivates me in this campaign. Just to bring it to a practical level, one of the things that I'm doing in this campaign is speaking the truth, at least my beliefs, unapologetically. And if that's the right political strategy, great. It'll be for the people of this country to decide, and I'll be the next president of the United States in January 2025. But I would rather lose that election and still speak what the truth is at every step of the way than to play some political snakes and ladders. And I think that's part of what's actually gotten the energy behind this campaign to get it off the ground in the early days.
Yeah, the more I think about this, the more I go further back. I go from the beginning of time, because if you go back to the original ideas that humans talked about, it was a seeking of truth that motivated them.
One of the things that we're going to share in common, I believe, I'm not saying this to flatter you, but just so you have the factual backdrop. I was kind of one of your super fans back when, you were in this game back in the mid to late 2000s. I graduated from college in 2007, and back then I used to call myself a libertarian. I can tell you why I call myself more of a conservative today, but I think we're cut from similar cloths, that if there's one thing I want to do as the next U.S. president, I'm thinking about January 2033 when I'm leaving office. What do I want to be saying that we accomplished? Number one on the list is that we will in this country once again have 3 branches of government, not 4. I think that fourth branch, the rise of that fourth branch, is I think the number one obstacle to the realization of the American dream itself, to the realization of the ideals enshrined in our Constitution, including the main filter that distorts our pursuit of the truth as well. So I don't believe, Dr. Paul, that all solutions are going to be delivered by government. In fact, I believe that most will hopefully not be delivered through government. My background is as an entrepreneur. I built a biotech company. That was my first career. In my most recent career, I've been pushing back against some of the orthodoxies that we see in the marketplace, like the rise of the ESG movement, through offering market alternatives, which is the first best choice. But there are certain things that I am not in a position to do through the private sector, that I'm not in a position to do through writing books or starting businesses. And the top of the list is, I think, actually restoring a 3-branch constitutional republic. And yes, I think that's also the biggest threat to federalism itself, is that fourth branch in the federal government. It's a threat to separation of powers, and it's a threat to federalism. And if there's one thing that motivates me in this race, one thing that I'm going to deliver, it's to revive the national identity of our constitutional republic by restoring those three branches. And that's something I think the next U.S. president can do. And that's something that I think we probably share in common as a passion. I'm not 100% sure on that. We haven't spoken before.
Right.
But that's something that I'm in this to actually deliver, and I think we can get done.
Oh, very good.
Really a delight to speak with you. Obviously very successful and intelligent, and there are a lot of libertarians that are interested in what you have to say. Now, I'm not a wealthy man. You're a very successful entrepreneur. Occasionally I do find a couple quarters under the couch. But we heard from the Pentagon yesterday that they actually looked under the couch and found $6 billion, $6.2 billion that they meant to send to Ukraine, and they didn't send it to Ukraine. You tweeted out, I think earlier, if anyone else had done this, they'd be in prison. So they found this money. It sounds really great, a little bit of a windfall. They want to send it to Ukraine. You think that's a good idea?
I think it's an awful idea. I think that we have gotten into a bad habit in this country of fighting politically correct wars, and this is the politically correct war of our time. I don't think there should be such a thing as a politically correct war. War itself is a thing that we should actually avoid, unless in the rare circumstance that it ever is required to protect Americans here on American soil. So what I've said as U.S. president is not only would I end the Ukraine war and stop the bleeding of the money, I think that much would be good, but I also want to use this as an opportunity. I'm an optimist. I believe in using every silver lining we're given, even in the mistakes that we've made, to our advantage. I want to end the Ukraine war on terms that also stop us from ever going to war with China over Taiwan. What does that mean? That sounds like maybe a crazy man talking. Let me explain that to you, because neither political party is talking about this, and I think it's achievable. I think it's achievable because Vladimir Putin does not enjoy being Xi Jinping's little brother. Yet, he is in a military partnership with China. The 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Cooperation, they called it, and also the 2022 No Limits Partnership. They're in a military alliance with one another. That's why China, per those treaties, is coming to Russia's aid to now fight Ukraine. Here's the deal I would do with Putin. I would say we would stop this war. We're done with it. Okay, we don't want this to be another Vietnam or an Iraq. We've gotten into the bad habit of endless, pointless wars. This is another one of them brewing as we speak. Put an end to it. But I'm going to put an end to it on terms that actually get us even more out of this, which is that Putin, in return for us freezing the current lines of control, in return for us committing, as I believe we should, that Ukraine will not be admitted to NATO, Putin has to, most importantly, I'll ask a few other things of him too, move the nuclear weapons out of Kaliningrad, get the Russian military out of Cuba and Venezuela, and out of the Western Hemisphere. But the most important thing I'll demand he gets done is he exits that military partnership with China. That restores now a trilateral international order where none of the three major nuclear superpowers are allied, rather than the bilateral one that exists today. So the conventional wisdom is, if Vladimir Putin takes over any territory, that's going to embolden Xi Jinping to go after Taiwan. That is wrong. The real thing that emboldens Xi Jinping to go for Taiwan is his military partnership with Russia, because Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world and hypersonic missile capabilities ahead of the United States. What we should be doing is pulling Russia out of China's camp, and we can do that if we end the Ukraine war by saying that we're not sending any more money, no NATO membership for Ukraine. Those are big wins in Putin's eyes, but we get a bigger win in return, which is we pull Russia out of China's camp. And I think it's going to take that kind of foreign policy vision to restore peace, pull America out of these pointless wars, but in a way that, yes, does advance American interests first, not just by having our head in the sand and preaching first principles. I am driven by first principles, but I'm also a believer in translating that into pragmatism, and we have an opportunity to do it. It disappoints me that we don't have a single presidential candidate in either major political party talking about that right now. And I believe I have the vision here and the commitment to actually be able to deliver on that pretty quickly in my first term as president.
I was drafted, and I know all about that, but all they talked about, when was it going to end? When was it going to end? And we elect a president and he doesn't end it. It just goes on and on. I want to know what you think about what major change in the philosophy of our foreign policy could keep us from getting involved, so that we don't have these details, because you have good ideas on how you do it, and I'm sure you could have done a better job than they did coming home from Afghanistan, or Vietnam, or all these places. But what we try to do at the Institute is find ways to get people to understand you're already in the war when you're leading up to war. And do you have any ideas on that, how to go back one step to not get engaged? And you have good ideas about how to disengage, but I'm thinking about it hasn't worked. So I'm trying to get people to think, let's stay out of that mess. Why do we have to go so far looking for a war?
Sir, the idealistic answer is have more people go back and read George Washington's farewell address after his term in office. I mean, it's a beautiful statement of what I think of as the original America First vision. I call myself a George Washington America First conservative, not engaging abroad without actually having American interests at issue. That was the original vision. We would do well to remember it.
I had a question. Now, you got a lot of mileage, and deservedly so, out of just coming out and saying, you know what, I would pardon Trump immediately as president. I think that's a great statement. But I'm looking at we have a very lively live chat, and we're grateful to them. But they're all interested, and that sounds great, they say. But what about Assange and Snowden? How do you feel about that?
Pardon. And I've been very clear about that. And you want any good answer of even bringing people along on this who might disagree with me? Assange sits in foreign exile. And by the way, I might ask for some of your listeners or yourselves on help. I've had a lot of trouble with this. I'm trying to visit Julian Assange. Actually, I have a planned trip to the UK that I'd committed to speak at something in September. I want to see him during that visit and face-to-face have that conversation. So if there's anybody in your network, they're making it really hard to see him. But that's something that I'm keen to do.
We can help you with that.
Yeah, I would hope so, given I would take it gladly. I intend to pardon him because even the people who disagree with me, they have nothing to say to me on this. Chelsea Manning, the government employee who leaked the information to Assange, who just merely published it, actually had her sentence commuted by President Obama because she's a member of a favorable political class. Let's call the truth what it is. She's transgender. I think that we should not have the two tiers, and this is nothing against anti-trans comment or anything like that. It's just a statement of how the federal police state works. There's two tiers of justice, or multiple tiers of justice. An intersectionality-based theory of justice, based on how high or low you are in the intersectional pyramid. There's now not only a different claim on economic goods, there's now a different claim on justice itself. Antifa treated one way, peaceful protesters of a different persuasion treated a different way. Chelsea Manning treated one way, Julian Assange treated another, Trump one way, Biden another. Enough with it. We have to have one rule of law grounded in the Constitution we wrote, that set this nation into motion almost 250 years ago. That's what we need to revive today.
Now, just to make it a little worse, the two things I said that the Greeks were primarily concerned with at this early stage was change and multiplicity. Well, having denied change, Parmenides went on with apparently equal consistency to deny multiplicity. There is no multiplicity. There are no variety of things. Why? Well, he, like everybody at this early period, was a monist. And remember, a monist means somebody who believes there's only one stuff which makes up the world. But in addition, he believes that the world is a plenum, solidly packed. There are no spaces. Well, then he asked, what in the world would make one thing different from anything else? How would you draw a line and say, here's one thing and here's another? The world is one solid, undifferentiated slab of one stuff which has no spaces between it. So there's nothing to separate one thing from another thing. We have to therefore say that multiplicity is an illusion. The world is just a hunk of undifferentiated stuff. There's nothing to distinguish one part from the other. Again, there are no entities. Or putting it another way, there's just one entity, everything, which he called the one, and you can see why. See, it's no longer the one in the many, because the many are gone now. It's just the one. Now that, believe it or not, is the ancestor of the Christian God. By several transmutations and permutations, Parmenides I became the God of Christianity, but it took quite a while for it to happen. So the world is simply a motionless, changeless, undifferentiated ball of tightly packed matter. Now, needless to say, this is not the way it appears to our senses. It appears as though there is multiplicity. It appears as though there's change. What is Parmenides' answer? Same as Heraclitus. Senses are deceptive. They give us only the world of appearances, which is not true reality. True reality is the motionless one, and it is arrived at by logic, not by the senses, by reason, as he interpreted reason. And therefore, again, we have rationalism epistemologically. Parmenides, like Heraclitus, only coming to the opposite conclusion.
As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Wednesday passed a resolution to pressure President Biden to escalate U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war by supplying Kiev with longer-range missiles. The bill calls on Biden to immediately arm Ukraine with the Army tactical missile system known as the ATACMS, and these missiles have a range of up to 190 miles and the ATACMS can be fired by the HIMARS rocket systems that the U.S. has been providing Ukraine. So providing the ATACMS would give Ukraine the ability to hit more targets inside Russia, potentially. The Biden administration claims that it does not want Kiev using the weapons to hit Russian territory, but the restriction does not apply to Crimea. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced $1.3 billion in new economic aid for Kiev at a meeting on Ukraine's reconstruction that was held in London, known as the Ukraine Recovery Conference. So according to the State Department, the $1.3 billion will go toward general economic assistance to repair and modernize Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and support for Ukraine's commitment to energy sector reforms. The $1.3 billion is being drawn from spending that Congress has already authorized for the Ukraine war, which at this point totals $113 billion. The State Department said that the new aid is in addition to the $63 billion in U.S. assistance that's been provided to Ukraine since Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022. So that's the total that the State Department is saying, and this is the funds that are going directly to Ukraine. That $63 billion includes $40 billion in military aid, although the Pentagon did just say that they overvalued weapons, that they found some more money, claiming that they were overvaluing weapons by $6.2 billion. So I think their adjusted number is that they've sent about $34 billion in weapons to Ukraine. So Zelensky told BBC that this counteroffensive that Ukraine launched earlier this month is going slower than desired, as Ukrainian forces have not made many gains and they're taking heavy losses. Zelensky told BBC, quote, "Some people believe this is a Hollywood movie and expect results now. It's not. What's at stake is people's lives," end quote. President Biden calls President Xi a dictator after Blinken's Beijing talk. So this is really just unbelievable. So on Tuesday, President Biden called Chinese President Xi Jinping a dictator, and this is just one day after Blinken met with Xi in Beijing. So Biden made the comments at a fundraiser event in California, saying that Xi was embarrassed by the Chinese balloon that wound up over U.S. territory in February. Biden said, quote, "The reason why Xi Jinping got very upset in terms of when I shot that balloon down with 2 boxcars full of spy equipment in it is he didn't know it was there. No, I'm serious. That's what a great embarrassment for dictators when they didn't know what had happened," end quote. So, a little jumbled there, but you get the point here, saying it's a great embarrassment for dictators. And so Biden has repeatedly claimed that this balloon had 2 boxcars full of spy equipment. We haven't seen it. They did recover some debris, and they haven't shown evidence to show that it was a surveillance balloon. For their part, China maintains that it was a civilian weather balloon. But what's interesting here is Biden is acknowledging that China did not mean to fly the balloon over the U.S. and that it was blown off course due to unexpected weather. He said, quote, "That wasn't supposed to be going where it was. It was blown off course up through Alaska and then down through the United States. And he didn't know about it. When it got shot down, he was very embarrassed," end quote. So again, we knew that from a lot of reports in the media and U.S. officials speaking to the media that it was blown off course, and people have shown it, tracking the balloon from when it was launched. But it's just interesting that Biden's admitting it, and there's all that hysteria, that big frenzy. You remember they shot down 3 more things that we don't even know what they were. They were probably people's hobby balloons that cost, like $10 and are really small. And they used $400,000 missiles to shoot them down. So this is a pretty big escalation in Israel's military actions in the West Bank. So this is from Middle East Eye, this article. The Israeli military killed 3 Palestinians in a drone strike near Jenin on Wednesday in the first aerial attack in the occupied West Bank in nearly 20 years. So the Palestinian civil defense said that the remains of 3 men were found at the location of the strike, but Israeli forces were withholding the bodies. The Israeli military confirmed the attack and claimed that it targeted a squad of Palestinian fighters near the Jalama military checkpoint, which sits around 5 kilometers north of Jenin. So the Jenin brigades said that 2 of the slain men belonged to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement's military branch. And it said the 3rd man was a leader in the Fatah-affiliated Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. So they were affiliated with these militant groups. So they're saying that the drone strike is the first, aerial strike, aerial targeted killing in the West Bank since the second Intifada in the early 2000s. And this is a huge escalation. And they're saying, the people that Middle East Eye is talking to is that they think this is going to become, Israel's probably going to do this more now. They've kind of, now that they've launched this drone strike, we might see more. And this comes after there's been lots of raids in the West Bank. There was recently just a big one in Jenin, and I believe more people have died from that. The death toll now is at least 6. A 14-year-old girl that was wounded in that raid succumbed to her wounds, I believe on Wednesday, and died. So there's just a lot of violence. So after that raid, there was a Palestinian, 2 Palestinians shot and killed 4 Israeli settlers. And then after that, there was another one of these big settler rampages, in several areas in the West Bank, lighting cars on fire.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
So you wouldn't be able to acquire those things and that money without the state's intervention. And so it's not right to say, I own 100% of this. No, we as a society have decided that we need to provide certain services coercively. And so you don't have a right to all that. To some degree, what you earn is kind of the result of everybody in society providing a certain framework within which a market order is possible. So then we'll decide what we think is a sensible percentage of what you quote unquote earn for you to keep. But it's not really exclusively yours, because if it had been only your doing, you probably wouldn't have been able to earn it, because you would have been living in a society where life was solitary, brutish, solitary. What's the Hobbesian formulation? Nasty, brutish, and short?
Short, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, do you want me to address that? Because that takes us right into the heart of libertarianism, which of course is that, who's the we? You talked about we several times. We decided. Who's we? How do we get to decide this? Okay. I don't remember being asked. Were you asked?
No, I never am. I'm always left out of these things.
Yeah, me too. And here's the thing. Okay, look, people say, oh, well, you wouldn't have this and you wouldn't have that. You wouldn't have roads. Let's take the Hackney Tunnel example. And the answer is, well, I often think in Neanderthal days, some guy standing on the side of the hillside of a valley looking across to the other and thinking, oh my God, I'd love to go over there if only we had a road. What did he do? Well, he got on his hind legs and he got up and he walked. Look, all of these things will be provided. And of course, no libertarian is suggesting that all of these goods, to the extent that they are goods, roads or water or sanitation and so on, are cost less. They have to be paid for. And no libertarian objects to paying for them. I don't. But what I do object to is getting an unitemized bill for services, some of which I have great difficulty in seeing. So let's take the difference. Imagine that food distribution worked in the same way, and that you were levied, I don't know, $10,000 a year for food by the food distribution agency of the state. And they decided what foods you would get, when you would get them, how you would get them, and where you would get them. And you would think, well, I'm not all that keen on that idea. Why don't we have it so that lots of people are in the business of distributing food, and I go to them and I make a particular deal with a particular person for the food that I actually want and that he's prepared to sell me. And so the libertarian model for all services is similar to the way in which we deal with food production, distribution, and sales. I am happy to have roads, but I'm happy to pay for them. But what I'm not happy to is to pay for them several times over and pay for them more than I think they're worth, without having the possibility to engage in considering other services or other providers of roads that might be willing to do so better and at a cheaper cost. So there's so much more to say, but I don't really want to go on.
But I still feel like some of these foundational things need to be hit on, at least here and there. Yeah. A society exactly like the one we have now, except without a social welfare or without a safety net. And this would have terrible, devastating consequences for many, many vulnerable people. I can understand that there's a superficial plausibility to that claim, and I can understand why somebody would believe it, and why even why a person of genuine goodwill might believe it and be concerned about it. What's a libertarian's response to that, or what's another way of thinking about what's likely to happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And so the issue is often framed in the form of a dilemma, which is that either you have a safety net of social welfare, which requires the institution of the state, with all of its coercive powers, of course, including the powers we all know to confiscate and redistribute your property, or you have a libertarian world with no coercive states, or states with coercive activities confined to the provision of law and justice, but also no social welfare and hence no safety net for the poor. And that's a dilemma as it is presented to us. But of course, the dilemma is false. And the way to refute a dilemma is by going between its horns. And the fact is that when you do a little bit of historical research, you discover that there was social welfare long before the state ever got into the welfare business. Forms of non-state social welfare that provided hospitals, schools, and unemployment assistance, and much, much more. And this is something which, for many people, has just simply gone down the Orwellian memory hole about which they know nothing. And the key to this are what are called friendly or fraternal societies or mutual aid societies, which have existed for centuries and which provided long before the state ever got into the business. Because remember, for most of its existence, the taxes that the state levied on people were used to fund wars, 90 to 95%. Almost nothing went on anything else. So that people were forced, because of this, if for no other reason, to provide for themselves. And they did. And they've been doing it since about the 17th century. So the modern libertarian would say, well, what we need to do is to reinvigorate and reintroduce things like friendly or fraternal or mutual aid societies. And that's the way it would be in a libertarian polity. I just want to make, before I finish on this point, Tom, I just want to make one thing, which is that critics of libertarianism generally say, what you want is the absolute freedom to do whatever you like with your property. And your society is going to be just like the way we have things today, except without the state and the services it provides. And of course, that's nonsensical. That's not what okay, maybe there are libertarians whose idea of the good life is to go live in the woods and shoot squirrels. But I suspect that most libertarians want to live in society with other people and listen to music and art and make a living and provide services and receive them in return. And this is perfectly capable of being done without the coercive powers of the state. So the libertarian vision of a society is not just what we have today minus the state and what it provides, but a society in which we, the people, everyone, we provide these services for ourselves in ways that are mutually beneficial and enriching, not only financially, but morally, and in terms of producing self-respect and control over our lives.
Hey, folks, let's take a minute. There's a correlation that I can't prove is causal, but that is highly, highly suggestive. And if it were running the other way, well, you can be absolutely certain it would be used against us. And that is, at least in the United States, I can say with no fear of contradiction, that the rate of poverty declined much, much more rapidly before the late 1960s, when the real big expansion of the welfare state occurred, both in the kinds of programs and the amount of money spent on them. Whereas after that happened, we saw the numbers kind of stagnate. Now, if it had been the opposite, if there had been all these social welfare programs and poverty was declining like crazy, and then we took them away and the numbers stagnated, we'd never hear the end of it, right? We'd never hear the end of it.
That's
but
true.
when reality is the way I'm describing, I don't think most people even realize that.
There's nothing in that I could disagree with. That's absolutely correct. And so we have what's known as the poverty or the welfare trap, where, many people want to be, as it were, on welfare. But what you have then is the welfare system is actually crowding out the rewards of employment at the bottom end of the scale. So that here's the kind of comparison that somebody might make. If I work for 40 hours a week at a not particularly attractive job, I can make, let's say, 50 euros more than I would if I didn't work at all. And so is it worth my while to do that? Because I will lose my benefits. And all I will be 50 euros better off with 40 hours of work down. And in a way, there's a kind of rational decision to be made here. And you can see why somebody would say, well, it's not worth my while. It's simply not worth my while. And once you, as you pointed out here from the Murray passage, once you've taken away any status that might be appropriated, as it were, by somebody who actually has a job, then the only difference between being on welfare, being on benefits, and being employed is that 50 euros for the 40 hours that you're working. And people would say, I'm working 40 hours for 50 euros. That's just €1.20 or whatever per hour, and it's not worth my while. And so we have a problem that's probably irremediable under the current way of thinking. It's just really impossible to go back. And of course, the extent and the rewards of so-called welfare and benefits has expanded. The number of people who are on benefits has expanded. The amount that they receive has expanded. The cost to the taxpayer is astronomical. But the problem is that once you introduce any particular benefit of any particular kind, it's almost impossible, politically possible anyway, from an electoral point of view, to remove it without inviting retribution from those voters who were in receipt of the benefit that you presented.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
You have another article that's coming out tomorrow, No Warrant, No Problem. And it's about how there used to be a thing called the Fourth Amendment. It seems to not exist anymore. Could you explain it, please?
Well, the Fourth Amendment, thank you, Gerald, and thanks for the kind introduction. As people watching us now undoubtedly know, the Fourth Amendment was written to secure the right to privacy. It expressly guarantees that right and expressly says the government can only interfere with that right when it gets a search warrant based on probable cause of crime sworn to under oath to the judge who signs the warrant. So when the feds want to surveil us and they don't have evidence of crime, but they just have an insatiable attitude for information about us, here's what was revealed last week. Avril Haines, not well known to the public, but Joe Biden's director of national intelligence, she's the nominal boss of the 16 federal spying agencies that the government acknowledges, delivered a report to the Senate in which she revealed that her agencies regularly purchase data about us from the entities with which we are unwitting custodians. As an example, they want to know where I drove my truck in the past 2 weeks. They will go to General Motors and say there's a computer chip in Judge Napolitano's truck. Download the computer chip and send us a bill. And General Motors will say, well, he voluntarily drove the truck. He's voluntarily telling us where the truck is going. So yeah, we'll give you that information. That is doing indirectly by buying it from a private entity what they could never do directly getting a search warrant because they have no evidence of crime. So they do this in massive numbers. It's massive warrantless spying, from the manufacturer of your motor vehicle to your computer telecom, to your bank, to anybody else that has records about you. And she revealed it. Did anybody in the Congress complain? One senator, a hard lefty, who's very good on civil liberties. He's terrific on civil liberties and privacy. Senator Ron Wyden, the only one who complained. They should strip from the budgets of these intelligence agencies all funds to do this. They should fire and have prosecuted anybody who does this. It is a blatant violation of their oaths to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution.
America was a colony under the British. They had the Stamp Act. And could you explain more about that?
The Stamp Act required that everyone in the colonies, not in Great Britain, or there would have been a revolution there, everyone in the colonies have a stamp on every piece of paper. So every book, every pamphlet, every letter, every financial document, even a poster to be nailed to a tree. You had to go to a British government post office, really, and buy the stamp. Now, it wasn't a stamp like we use today. It was more akin to a rubber stamp, which they put on with a stencil, and it was a British regal insignia. So the issue is, how did the British government 3,000 miles away know if their colonists were complying with the Stamp Act? They gave British agents and soldiers general warrants. A general warrant says search where you want, seize whatever you find. It doesn't specifically describe the place to be searched or the person or thing to be seized. It isn't based on probable cause of crime. It's based on government need. What the hell kind of a standard is government need? Whatever the government wants, it'll claim it needs. The government wanted to get into the homes of the colonists under the pretext of looking for the stamps. What were they really looking for? They were looking for revolutionary materials so they could predict who was going to foment resistance to the king.
The United States has become the country that our founding fathers fought against.
Yes.
And it's the mentality of Great Britain. Those lovely, lovely Brits who speak so properly, and the sun never set on the British Empire as they slaughtered millions of people around the world and stole whatever they wanted and killed whoever they wanted to. But
exactly
you have to
right.
say it properly. And that's become America.
Yes.
What's your favorite war? You like the Vietnam War? No, I like the Iraq War. I like the second Iraq War better than the first Iraq War. I like the Afghan War. How about the Libyan War? Hey, about that Yugoslavian War? What Yugoslavian War? Oh, you mean when NATO, when the Bill Clinton attacked Yugoslavia and destroyed the place? Oh, forget that. Don't even talk about that. Oh, how about Assad has to go? Oh, we only killed, about 700,000 Syrian people have died since Barack Obama said Assad has to go. We become the country that our founding fathers have fought against. They've robbed us of our rights every week. Every week, you are writing about how they've robbed our constitutional rights.
So when Jefferson and company coined the phrase taxation without representation is tyranny, do you know what the highest tax rate was collectively, because it wasn't on income, imposed by the Brits on the colonists?
Yeah.
3%. Today, if you lived in New York City and made a good income, it would be about 59%.
Yeah, and that's something.
Well, 3% was enough for a bloody revolution. What is 59% enough for?
Yeah.
Wow.
You're
exactly right. We have become the country from which we rebelled.
Yep.
Far worse, far less freedom, far more confiscatory taxes, far heavier and intrusive government than Jefferson and Madison could ever have imagined.
Look what they did with the COVID war crap.
Correct.
Close down your business. I'm the governor. I'll tell you what to do. Look at that little piece of crap you got over there, that little Murphy boy. Oh, where did he come from? The Goldman Sachs gang?
Yep.
Oh, yeah. How about that arrogant little boy we had over here, Andy Cuomo? I'm a daddy's boy. I'm renaming the Tappan Zee Bridge after my daddy. Close your business down. I'll tell you what to do. Yes, sir. Another sad note. You know, one of my sayings is when all else fails, they take you to war. And someone just called me this morning and said, you know, we hear you say that all the time. But the other thing is when war fails, they'll take us to nuclear war. And the Ukraine war is failing. And you just sent me an article that you wrote, and it's very, very, very powerful. Could you explain more about that and what's going on?
It was a statement on the internet posted by the head of FSB. FSB is the Russian CIA. Now, we all know that each of these, I know you don't like this word, but they call themselves this, each of these intel agencies spy on each other. The CIA spies on Mossad, Mossad spies on the CIA. The FSB spies on the CIA spies on the FSB. We all know that. The head of the FSB said last night, we know from spying on our partners and our enemies in the intelligence community that the Western nations now realize that Ukraine is losing and will lose this war. They realize it internally, and they know that we know that they realize it. And yet they are still funding the war. He's 100% correct. We know from the documents that kid, Jack Teixeira, has been indicted, kid in Massachusetts, for revealing that the entire Pentagon, the brass in the Pentagon, is of the view that Ukraine can't win the war. And still, we're sending billions and billions over there.
Yep.
But House votes to censure Adam Schiff. It has not been a good day for the congressman from California. First, he was owned by John Durham while the Democrats attempted a character assassination. And now the House of Representatives have voted to censure Representative Adam Schiff on June 21st. Now, we're not really talking a lot about the Durham's trip before Congress, but there was a lot going on with that as well. But he was voted on the censure. And a lot of people on this vote said, who are those 6 Republicans who voted president? We need to get them. Well, thankfully, Anna Paulina Luna, who's a representative who brought forth the legislation, she explained why those voted present. If we can put that next one up. And I think it's important to see this. For those wondering who voted present, members who sit on ethics traditionally vote present, as they do not weigh in on investigations prior to them coming through the committee. This is typically the case on both sides. Also, although Representative Thomas Massey and I disagreed on my first resolution, he did assist me in helping with some of the votes for the new resolution that passed. Thank you to all who worked together for accountability. And the real reason I bring this up, and we kind of took Massey's side on this, and you certainly did when you said, hey, where's this $13 or $16 million coming from? That was his big objection to it. And he was piled on by a lot of Republicans, by a lot of people. Oh my gosh, Massey sold out. He's a terrible guy. No, he stood up for the Constitution. Congress doesn't have this authority. I think that Adam Schiff is as much of a creep as everyone else does, but I'm not going to break the rules to punish him. I'm just going to say he stood by his values, and he won in the end, and he won the right way.
Yeah, and he has a reputation that really helps him out on those issues like that. Because if it was just immediate and it was a one-time deal, you can get hit pretty hard. I can remember one time, I think it was a vote on Cardinal O'Connor.
Oh, yeah.
and I voted no, and I was the only one. And before I got back to the office, there were a few of you standing there. Oh, you better watch. Boy, they're calling from all over. But I think somebody came up from the staff and said, oh, yeah, it's the New York Times. They really want to talk to you about that. and the staff talked to him before I didn't talk to him. And the staff kept talking to him. They said, oh, he votes against all those gold medals. And,
the air went out.
It was nothing to it. They have to find that, gut-wrenching controvery. So it wasn't controversial, which is making the point that, if you have something, you tell your people what you believe in.
Really, I think Adam Schiff is the poster child for all that was wrong with the Russiagate, because he, through the end, and I think what was most despicable about what he did, and we've talked about it on the show, is that he hid behind his position as House Intelligence Committee chair and said, I've seen concrete evidence that President Trump colluded with the Russians. I can't tell you, of course, because it's classified, but it's concrete evidence. And I can imagine a lot of people, and we know there are good people that do work in the intelligence community. Of course, there's a lot of bad things that go on, but there are decent, honest people. And I can imagine those people being furious because what he did was he weaponized the intelligence process, the process of analyzing intelligence information and coming to conclusions. He weaponized that for political reasons and used it against Trump and the Republicans. That's absolutely despicable, but it also undermines the credibility of the intelligence community itself.
Right.
They said, early stages of Ukrainian counteroffensive, quote, not meeting expectations, Western officials tell CNN. And this is from the article, Dr. Paul, and I think this says a lot, and I think it vindicates a lot of the people that we know as good friends, Scott Ritter, Colonel McGregor, and others who were saying this from the beginning and were ridiculed and harassed and being accused of all sorts of things. You're just being in the pay of Putin. Well, it turns out, as usual, they're right. If we can put this next one on, this is from the CNN article. Remember, this is CNN talking. And when CNN has to admit even this, then you know something's going on. Now, I highlighted one part of this. Now, this is hard to read, and I apologize. But here's how the CNN article starts, Dr. Paul. In its early phases, Ukraine's counteroffensive is having less success. And here's the part I underlined, Russian forces are showing more competence than Western assessments expected, said two Western officials. The counteroffensive is, quote, not meeting expectations on any front. It's failing across the entire front, in other words. But the part that's important, I think, Dr. Paul, and it goes to the entire way that foreign affairs analysis works in Washington. Russian forces are showing more competence than Western assessments expected. These assessments are based on politics rather than analysis. How many times do we see Russia's running out of missiles? They'll be out of missiles next week. It happened for the entire year. It doesn't matter if you like Russia or hate Russia. But when you have the whole military establishment together with the media saying Russia's losing, Russia's going to lose, Russia's weak, it's disorganized. You can't organize your foreign policy based on this kind of circle of lies.
But the propaganda people have done a pretty good job on putting those lies out, and most Americans still believe it. And what they were repeating all the time, the war is the attack Russia did, in not too many months ago, invaded Ukraine. So it was always Russia against Ukraine. At the same time, they say, well, if maybe Russia is in a more defensive mood than an offensive mood, because they have the power and they can do a lot more. And but they don't ever say, well, how did the war really start?
Yeah.
What if the war, since the beginning, for let's say even almost 9 years now, it started by us throwing out one government and again putting another government in and dealing with a coup back in 2014, and it's all been based on a lie. And if from that point on, if there would have been more of the people you mentioned and the other few journalists that they have to put this in a perspective, without getting in a position to say, the Russians or either the Chinese, they're angels, and that's why we do that. We look at it more objectively of what we have done, and that to me is a big deal, because this just like you put up those clips about the people who were lying about the insurrection and all that, they lie through their teeth. But here, this whole war, in many ways, is built by a lie. Especially, what about the documentation of the diplomacy since World War II, and especially since 1989, and the comments and the promises that we have made, and that's important. But you just don't see that on the mainstream media, not at all. And yet, there's still a lot of people, slowly but surely, are being exposed to the truth, and it's starting to make sense for them. But that's the problem, though. It's still that we're behind because the propaganda machine from the far left and the media is pretty powerful.
There are real consequences to believing your own propaganda, because it leads you to do things that you otherwise would not do if you took a rational approach to things. And if you look at one of those, some of the propagandas, we have the strongest, best equipped military in the world. Well, you're sending your best things in there right now. NATO is sending its best military equipment into Ukraine right now, and it's getting absolutely slaughtered. Those Leopard 2 tanks, the Bradleys, they're burning like marshmallows over an open fire. So you have a danger of being too reckless when you believe your own propaganda, and I think that's what we're seeing here. It doesn't matter if you like what's happening or you hate what's happening. There's a danger in doing that. But the other thing from the CNN article that I wanted to point out, Dr. Paul, if you could put that next clip, because you said this early on, and you were criticized for being, he just is go back one if you don't mind. He just is taking Putin's side. Now, this is Mark Milley. He said this is a very difficult fight. It's a very violent fight. It will take a considerable amount of time and a high cost. And Secretary of Defense Austin said, the Ukrainians have the ability to recover equipment that's been damaged, repair, There will continue to be battle damage, but they have a lot of combat capability. Now, the point here is both of them are saying there is going to be enormous losses here, but they've got to keep going. And you wrote very early on, They're trying to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian. And here they are literally admitting that that's the goal.
You know, the opposition that I claim has most of the control of mainstream media and influence a lot of people in the country. And they do this with a tone of moral high ground.
Yeah. Here's a neat tweet from Rand Paul that came out yesterday. Senator Paul said, "The good news is that Ukraine caught their highest judge hiding some of his more than $2 million in bribes in pickle jars. The bad news is that Ukraine, consistently ranked as one of the most corrupt nations on the planet, still has high-ranking officials robbing it blind." He continues, "This might be a salient point when Ukraine returns to Congress for beg for more U.S. taxpayer funds. Why won't Democrats accept my call for a special inspector general to oversee the billions of dollars we send to Ukraine?" To which Elon Musk responded, "Some accounting of how American taxpayer money is being spent sure sounds like a reasonable request." Hear, hear. So that was kind of a neat little exchange, and we said it from the beginning.
We need to hear more of those kind of tweets, right to the point, and that's good. And of course, Rand's been on that for a long time.
Yeah, he's the first one. Hey, I know I can't stop the money going, but can we at least have someone look over it? No, shut up.
Yeah, prepare for what's coming, but they'll wait 10 years when we are bankrupt, and they say, you know, we ought to check that. But then they ask, we need to audit. They get their audit of anything the Pentagon's been doing no easier than I get the auditing of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
The big stuff is sort of secret behind the scenes, even secret from the government.
What is wrong with his reasoning? Again, I'll wait till Aristotle, because one of Aristotle's main assignments in metaphysics was to answer Heraclitus and answer Parmenides. And to do so, Aristotle carved out certain concepts which he originated, which had never existed before, and which we use to this day. And he said those were the only concepts by reference to which we could answer Parmenides. So we'll see when we get to Aristotle. Now you see that people are in a very dreadful position philosophically now. We have a catastrophe almost at the very outset of Western philosophy. One philosopher with an array of arguments that seemed persuasive at the time to prove that everything is change and there are no things. Another philosopher with an array of arguments which seemed convincing to prove that nothing changes and there's only the motionless one. What are we going to do to reconcile these two philosophers? To take their arguments and somehow make sense of it all. That was the task of subsequent philosophy. Never properly answered till the time of Aristotle.
More and more begin to know the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Ukraine's bloody counteroffensive is not meeting expectations on any front as Ukrainian forces are struggling to break through Russia's defenses. The report said that according to Western assessments, Russia's lines of defense have been well fortified, and Russian forces have been able to bog down Ukrainian armored vehicles with missile strikes and minefields. One official said that Ukraine's forces were vulnerable to Russia's minefields and described the Russian defenses as competent. The officials stressed that the counteroffensive was still in its early stages and said they remained optimistic that Ukraine could eventually regain some territory. We know that the U.S. doubted that Ukraine could regain much territory in this counteroffensive, but they pushed for this thing anyway. And, you know, this is a NATO-funded, NATO-trained, NATO-equipped army. And the Biden administration has, you know, I've been mentioning this a lot since Blinken made that speech earlier this month, but I think it's really important how they have just flat out rejected the idea of a ceasefire, rejected the idea of a pause in fighting. They've rejected peace. So Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, on Thursday, he told the House Armed Services Committee that he wants to give President Biden the authority to intervene militarily in Cuba to take out Chinese assets that are allegedly on the island. So Gaetz said, quote, "I support an authorization for use of military force to take out the Chinese assets in Cuba," end quote. He wanted to add this authorization for military force as an amendment to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, but he had to withdraw it for procedural reasons. But he was saying, you know, he put it forward at this hearing. He said, quote, "To my hawk friends on the committee who think I'm too much of a dove, this amendment is an authorization to use military force given to President Biden to take out the Chinese assets in Cuba," end quote. And, you know, this comes after the Wall Street Journal reported that Beijing and Havana are negotiating to establish a joint military training facility in Cuba. Article 5 does not override Congress war powers. So on Thursday, a group of Republicans introduced a bill in the House and Senate that would reaffirm NATO's Article 5, that NATO's Article 5 does not override congressional war powers. The effort was led by Senator Rand Paul and Representative Chip Roy and Warren Davidson in the House. So Paul wrote in Responsible Statecraft announcing the legislation, quote, I introduced a resolution reasserting that Article 5 of the NATO Treaty does not supersede Congress's responsibility to declare war or authorize military force before engaging in hostilities, end quote. So NATO's Article 5 outlines mutual defense commitments of the 31-member alliance, but does not automatically mean that the U.S. must intervene militarily if a NATO ally comes under attack. So this is interesting, and I think this is a good point to make, and because I think a lot of people do. I used to think that it was automatic, but it's not true. So Article 5 states, I'll just read some of Article 5 here. It's a little wonky the way the language is, but Article 5 reads, quote, the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an armed attack against them all. And consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith individually and in concert with other parties such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. So to kind of summarize that, the way Rand Paul put it, it says that NATO members are required to assist each other in the event of an attack, but military action is not mandated. So President Joe Biden hailed a new era in the U.S.-India relationship after rolling out the White House red carpet for Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Thursday, touting deals on defense and commerce aimed at countering China's global influence. The partnership is stronger, closer, and more dynamic than at any time in history, Biden told reporters at a joint press conference with Modi, and the economic relationship is booming, with trade more than doubling over the past decade. Modi touted a new chapter in the country's strategic partnership after the two leaders emerged from the Oval Office talks, where the country's differences on Russia and human rights were on the table. Washington wants India to be a strategic counterweight to China and sees it as a critical partnership, although some analysts and former officials question India's willingness to stand up collectively to Beijing over issues such as Taiwan. Washington has also been frustrated by India's close ties with Russia amid Moscow's war in Ukraine. So I know this is a part, and what's interesting is that India now is the most populous country in the world. They just surpassed China. So the U.S. really, is hoping to use them against China. And, I wouldn't be surprised if in 30 years or so, India is the new enemy. That's the way things go.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Okay, what's different this time is that there are really two risks on the asset side for a bank. One is credit risk and the other is interest rate risk. So credit risk is getting paid back or not getting paid back. Interest rate risk is what happens if interest rates go up. Now, what's happened is we've had a 39-year decline in interest rates. So we haven't had to worry about, banks have not had to worry about this idea of interest rates going back up. If you go back to the global financial crisis, that was a crisis based on credit risk. Okay. What happened last year was that we had the biggest increase in rates and the worst decline in bond prices. Now, keep in mind that interest rates and bond prices go in the opposite direction. So this was the worst year for bond prices, the bond market, since the early days of the Republic. So there are a lot of interest rate losses. Where are they? Well, they happen to be residing on the bank's balance sheets. That's the problem. It's a very different problem than what we experienced in 2008.
Can you take just a minute, maybe use a very simple mathematical example to explain to people why it is that interest rates and bond prices move in opposite directions?
Yeah, so I'll try. So a bond is a loan. So let's use an example. I loan Tom Woods $100, okay? And let's say the market interest rate is 3%. Let's say this is over a 30-year period. So what that means is that I am hoping to get back $3 a year for 30 years. And at the end of 30 years, I get $100 back. Okay. So I now have an asset, which is this revenue stream at 3%. Now, what happens if interest rates go up to 6%? Well, I could make the same loan to somebody just as creditworthy as Tom Woods, but now I'm getting, instead of $3 a year, I'm getting $6 a year. All right. Now, obviously, the value of that loan that I made to Tom Woods has now dropped in value. What is it worth? Well, in a market of 6% interest rates, those interest payments are worth half of what they were when I first made the loan. Okay. Now, the principal that I get at the end, $100, is the same. But the way the math works out now, that loan, if I were to try to sell that loan to, let's say, a bank or somebody else, they would give me 40% less than when I first made that loan.
Okay. All right. I think that really helps. All right. So the banks are in a situation they haven't been in quite some time.
That's right.
Meanwhile, we have the institution of the Federal Reserve. Is there something the Fed can do to at least push off into the future any problems the banks might now face?
Well, I think they're really boxed in. And the problem is they could try to lower interest rates. But the problem is that they got themselves into this mess, or they got the banks into this mess by lowering interest rates. And the problem was that ended up increasing price inflation, which raised interest rates, which set off this whole chain of events that then trapped the banks. So I'm not sure, other than the Fed acting responsibly, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot that can happen, because the problem is, again, these loans have been made at low interest rates. The only way that the banks can be saved is if interest rates go back down. The Fed printing money has basically shown that this is going to lead to higher rates. So there really is not much they can do besides just acting responsibly, which I'm not sure I would want to bet on that. So total bank deposits peaked at about 18 trillion, and they're now at 18.1 trillion. They're now at 17.2 trillion. So you've had a pretty good outflow. All of these things are going in the wrong direction. And all it's going to take is depositors don't even have to be aware that there are problems. They can be totally blissfully unaware. But if they see that their bank is paying them 0.5% and they can get 4% and they start to leave, then this all gets exposed. These losses are exposed. And then what are the banks going to do?
Well, then that kind of is the question. I know you mean that rhetorically, but I'm trying to imagine what kind of headlines, if this kind of worst case scenario really does unfold, what kind of headlines are we going to see in the paper?
Well, the banks will be forced to sell assets. I mean, that's basically all they can do. And what do they have? Banks that have loans, they're illiquid, and they have securities, government securities, treasuries, munis, mortgage-backed securities. So I think what will happen is the banks will start to sell the most liquid, the easiest things that they can sell. And so that's going to put further pressure on bond prices, driving longer term rates higher, which is going to create a whole set of other problems, of course, for anybody like, let's say, the federal government that is highly indebted. But when they're having to sell everything, the prices are going to drop, and it's just going to make matters worse. So this has all been covered up very well. I think the authorities and the defenders of the system have done a remarkable job, but it's not going to take much to start to get this to unravel.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
The S&P 500, what did we say? Back in November, we said, no, the markets aren't going to go down. Following the last 40 midterm elections over 60 years, the S&P 500 has gone up 16.3% on average. And guess what? Now it's up 14%. So there's another side of the story. There's a downside coming. FedEx sales slide 10% as demand falls. UK recession fears mount after Bank of England hikes borrowing rates by more than expected. Today, they raised them 50 basis points. They raised them 50 basis points to a 15-year high at 5%. But yesterday, the inflation number came out. You know what inflation is in the UK? Or the FUCK? Because you got a bunch of little fucking pricks running the show. The scumbags that caused this problem with the lockdowns, the COVID war, and the sanctions they put on Russia. 8.7%. Okay, so now you got interest rates at 5%. You got negative interest rates. Oh, now you're worried about a recession? Fuck off. Send more money to Ukraine. Hey, Sudak. Hey, suck-ass. Why don't you keep going to Ukraine? Oh, no. You know what suck-ass Sudak said? Suck-ass Sudak. Suck-ass Sudak. You suck the ass of Zelensky as you're fucking over your people. Yep. He said, don't worry about it. I'm here to tell you I am totally 100% on it. And it's going to be okay. And we're going to get through this. He told workers in a warehouse, oh, did you get dressed up like a warehouse guy? Like you go over there to Ukraine and you put your military drag on? Oh, by the way, I get upset. You're fucking right, I get upset. I'm a fighter. I'm not a little boy that takes shit from anybody. I don't give it and I don't take it. But there's another side of Salenti. And you can see it on this channel. Yes. But I know what's going on in the world. And we got a bunch of fucking evil pricks. And I can't say the other way. I love this shit. If only women were in charge, we wouldn't have any war. Oh, yeah, like Hillary Clinton, when she was so happy when she heard Gaddafi was killed. We came. We saw he died. You came? I don't think you ever came, man. Want to talk about a dried out chick. Oh, I mean dried out in terms of life and leisure. On to the Ukraine war. Zelensky, if Ukraine loses, U.S. must choose between the collapse of NATO or going to war. How about go fuck yourself? Who the fuck are you to tell what America should do? And NATO, I don't give a fuck about NATO either. We have no need for NATO. And the same fucking bullshit. If the Russians take Ukraine, they're going to attack the rest of Europe. Fuck you. No, they're not. The same bullshit they sold with the Vietnam War. And Russia says U.S. and U.K. fully dragged into conflict if Crimea is bombed. The use of these missiles given by the United States and the U.K., Russia's defense minister said, outside the zone of our special military operation would mean the United States and Britain would be fully dragged into the conflict. So that's what they're doing. You hear Zelensky pumping it, and now the Russians are saying, we're going to go to war with you if you keep ramping us up and attacking us in Russia. Blinken announces $1.3 billion for Ukraine's reconstruction efforts. Isn't that great? You listen, little shithead. Every fucking day they got this fucking scumbag here. How could people listen to this little fucking prick if he has one? One jerk after another. There he is. I can't say anything bad about Lloyd Austin because the word is that if you come out against Miley or Austin, they're going to come after you. So this Blinken bullshit says that President Joseph Biden's top diplomat, Diplo in the mat, will provide $675 million to help modernize Ukraine's rail lines. Oh, yeah? As our rail lines are shit in this country, going on the subways at night in Calcutta? And then we got a lot more here, but I'm just going to sum up with this one. Israeli settlers launch West Bank attacks. They're not settlers, they're invaders. That's a word. They're not settlers, they're invaders. Hundreds of Israeli settlers set fires to Palestinian cars and houses in the occupied West Bank. Not occupied, stolen land against the Geneva Conventions. Maybe I'll get censored from YouTube for saying that and they'll call me an anti-Semite. And could you imagine if they did this in Israel? They set fire to 30 cars or 40 houses? Yeah, the latest cycle of violence in the West Bank, which Palestinians seek is the heart of the future state of Israel, is occupied since 1967. Not occupied, invaded.
Every single one of these problems are a result of government being way too big.
I would think the machine kind of has some responsibility to also debate this topic because take myself, for example. I never really researched whether or not vaccines cause autism. Didn't strike me as interesting. Not something I looked into. After what just happened with COVID, you got to bet your ass that unless I'm in some sort of an emergency situation, there isn't a single thing I'm not researching before I take. I'm not trusting a doctor on anything without doing some level of my own homework. I don't want to be in that situation. I don't like sitting down and reading. If I have kids, you think I want to research every single vaccine and what the correlation might be? I don't want to have like that. That's not something I want to do. Yes. But if you're an actual health official and you believe in general vaccinate, like I'm talking myself. I'm not saying that vaccinations do cause autism. I'm saying that after we were lied to in the way that we were after COVID, which they decided incorrectly to label as a vaccine, I would feel an obligation to personally do my own homework before vaccinating my own. Like I would just feel like I would have to do that. I would think that this is a very important topic, that if you're a scientist with information about why vaccines are actually preventing widespread disease, and that I shouldn't be a free rider and just assume that since 95% of the population is, vaccinated for measles, why put my child at risk? Because I'll free ride. It's almost like pollution in reverse, that I can just assume everyone else got vaccinated, so I'm not going to put my kids at risk and maybe that risk doesn't exist. But in the current landscape, there's got to be more people like me that are more hesitant of vaccines because of the failure of the mRNA vaccination program. And I would think that they would have some responsibility to actually be like, all right, well, we got to put that other thing to rest because it's important for the last 100 years of scientific advancement not to be looking backwards and thinking the vaccines can cause harm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And I think that there's probably a lot of people in both of our positions who kind of feel that way.
Than ever before. So I think the argument between, is it all the Fed's fault or is it all the congressional fault? I think it's all the deep state's fault, because my conclusion is I believe that the deep state, special people in special places, are able to manipulate and have a lot to say about the Federal Reserve, and as well as control placed on the Congress and the banking system. And that's where the problem is, the whole system. So we talk about current events and other things, but we still are concentrate on this program to talk about what needs to be done, and ultimately has to be a change in our monetary policy. Chris.
That's absolutely true, Dr. Paul. And you mentioned earlier, we hear about soft landing, and this week was Janet Yellen. And, people should know by now that the government will never tell you how bad it actually is. It's always fine. They always have it under control. You could be down to your last crust of bread, and they will tell you that you've never had it better. So my thoughts are the chances of a soft landing are slim to none. And, I was trying to think of an analogy as to why I think this way, and I did think of one. It's been almost 30 years since I went to bars or nightclubs, and back then, I don't know if they still do these things now, they used to have nights where it was 25-cent beers, and the place would be packed because beer was so cheap. And I thought to myself, what would have happened if they would have throughout the night raised the price to $1, and then $3, and then $5, and $10? That would have changed the entire scene. You couldn't deny that everything changed that night for everybody that's in the bar. The hangovers would start to kick in as the price went up, and the longer the price was up, the quicker the hangovers would kick in. Well, that's very similar to what we have with the Federal Reserve. They artificially kept rates at 0% for something like 10 to 15 years, and people got hooked on this 0% rates, and now we're at 5%. So to think that everything is the same and will be fine and they have it under control is to be very naive, because they changed the playing field. And the problem is not that the rates are now higher. The problem was the 0% rates. That was totally fake, and they created an entire fake economy bubble. And now the hangovers are starting to kick in, and the longer the Fed keeps rates where they are or raises them further, the more the hangovers are going to kick in. So I think soft landing is out of the question.
Chris, you bring up a good point, because the government does send out a lot of propaganda. It's getting to be more, more open, because people have figured it out. So if you look at the CPI and say, the CPI just went down a little bit or went up a little bit, a lot of people now in the markets, they will respond by saying, well, we don't really believe what the government's telling us, but we do believe that there will be a reaction to those numbers. So it's usually propaganda. But the Fed and the people who really run the show, they need support from the public. They just can't do it isolated. They tried that with COVID, but the people finally learned what was happening. They finally ended the nonsense of COVID. And so when they come in and they want this control, a special interest, and the people who benefit from a system like the dollar system under the Federal Reserve, it's always couched in moral tones, high-level tones. This we got to take care of the people. We got to protect our national security. We got to provide peace for the world. We got to have to be a good world policeman, and all this stuff. And if you don't do it, you're not very patriotic. So there's a lot of effort put into that. But what I sense in the last couple of years is a breaking away from that, and people are starting to think better, because they sense that the trouble is out there, which so far the Federal Reserve wouldn't admit. And even Congress, with their bipartisanship, they do talk about it and they know it. I think there's enough differences right now where some good suggestions are coming out of the Congress with the Republicans leading. But still, the big picture is controlled by a bipartisanship that generally aren't exactly in Washington. They're the ones who are behind the scenes, pulled the strings, and that is being exposed more and more. And it's also what has to be exposed if we ever get the country to agree to, a constitutional republic. Oh, you radical! And in a way, you can't be called a radical if you're a strict believer in the constitutional principles that are written down and literally believe that. Well, that's when you really are a radical. You could be called a terrorist by believing in something like that. That has to change, and that's what we hope we can participate in at the Liberty Report. On the short term, the debt and the malinvestment has to be liquidated. You just can't keep building on it. I mean, where are we? $1 trillion used to be a lot of money. Now, we're up to $32 trillion now, and the rate in the next 10 years is unbelievable, which I don't think will last, because something's going to crack, and it'll be a big deal. Because the malinvestment and debt, in order to get good, solid growth again, you need two things: the elimination and liquidation of the bad stuff and the bad investments, and also a change in the monetary system. You can't do this and just keep printing money. In 1875, they returned to the gold standard by removing greenbacks and having a sensible fiscal policy. Today, that's not the case. So we're in for a big trouble. We're in for a lot more inflation. I don't believe for a minute we're going to have a soft landing. I think there's already a rough landing for a lot of people, and that leads to political chaos. And some of these people who work in the deep state wanting to control the social order and the economic order, in truth, because they work through corporations, they're not like communists who are crystal clear, get rid of the corporations and free market. They work with the corporations and intimidate the corporations, and the corporations, sacrifice the principles that they should be beholding, and they evidently don't realize what happened. So as long as that's going that way, the conditions will get worse, and I believe that we're already in a society that is easily defined as corporatism, and that being very negative, that the corporations are partnerships with big business. And that to me is a serious dilemma. It will have to be proposed or exposed. But Mises said, if we continue on the road of interventionism, where government's involved in economics and all of these policies, which has gotten much worse since he's been around, that it will lead to fascism. Some people claim that it's on our doorstep. Hopefully we can contribute something that will prevent that from happening.
We haven't finished with Parmenides, though, because he had a famous follower, namely Zeno, Z-E-N-O, and he lived around between 490 and 430 BC. And he is famous for devising a series of paradoxes which purport to prove two things. Some of them purport to prove that motion is impossible, thus carrying out Parmenides' principle. And some of them purport to prove, one in particular, that multiplicity is impossible. Now I'm going to give you one of each. They all involve the same kind of reasoning, only sometimes it's more obvious and sometimes not. And again, I'm not going to answer them tonight because Aristotle devoted his attention to answering them, and in the process said some very valuable things about the nature of infinity. I'll just present to you two of Zeno's paradoxes, and you can get an idea what a dreadful position people were in at the time because they couldn't answer Zeno and they knew something had to be wrong. Well, his most simple one about motion is that it's impossible to cross a room. Why is it impossible to cross a room? Well, consider, to cross a room, you first of all have to cross half of it. But to cross half of it, first of all have to cross half of that. Quarter of it, in other words. And to cross that, you first of all have to cross half of it, an eighth. And of course, first a 16th and so on. Now he asked, how many times can a distance be subdivided? And his answer was, there's no end. If you say 1/zillionth of the distance, well, there's always 1/2-zillionth of the distance. You can divide without end. In other words, you can subdivide infinitely. But how can you possibly cross an infinite number of distances, no matter how tiny, tiny they are? Because to cross any distance would take some time, no matter how little. And to cross an infinite number of distances would take an infinite amount of time, but you die in 40 or 50 or 60 years. And therefore, you obviously couldn't cross a room, or any distance for that matter. And therefore, motion is an illusion. Now, this would apply to the motion of his tongue in uttering the argument. His tongue, to get from the upper palate to the lower, has to cross half the distance, and so on and so on. But that's his viewpoint. There are other trickier ones, but they all involve the same idea. You see what you can do with that for the next 3 or 4 weeks. Now, one of his paradoxes on multiplicity. Multiplicity is the view that the world consists of a number of things. For instance, you, and you, and you, and this. Or you can take it on the level of atoms if you want, or on the level of galaxies. Doesn't make any difference to the argument. Now, Zeno is going to argue that this is impossible. The world, in other words, cannot be a whole composed of parts. It has to be one indivisible slab, not a whole comprised of parts. Now, why? Well, he says, I'll show you that the idea that the universe has parts is filled with impossible contradictions. Well, for instance, let's imagine the universe is a whole, which has many parts. And let us ask, what would the size of the universe be? How many parts does the world have? He says, according to the people who believe in such a thing as parts. Well, if we keep on subdividing, how many parts will the world end up having? Well, he says, obviously, it'll end up with an infinite number of parts. Because every magnitude is theoretically divisible without limit. So if we break the world up into 1 foot long things, we can break each of those up into 2 6-inch things, and each of those into 4 3-inch things, and so on and so on. There's no theoretical end. So if we keep going, you have to grant that there is an infinite number of parts. And if there's an infinite number of parts, no matter how small each of them is, we must have an infinitely big universe, because infinity times any amount is infinitely big. Thus, we reach the conclusion that if the universe consists of parts, it must be infinitely large. But now look at it another way. What will be the size of the ultimate parts, the ultimate constituents when we finally reach them? Now he says there has to be such ultimate indivisible parts. Otherwise, we can't talk meaningfully about the world being a whole consisting of parts. If you're going to say a whole, there has to be parts. And that means there ultimately has to be something which is no longer divisible. But now, any magnitude, as we've seen, is divisible. So what must be the size of the ultimate parts if they're to be, even in theory, indivisible? They must be zero in size. The ultimate particles or constituents of the world must have no magnitude. But if a universe has parts which have no size, what will be the size of the whole? Obviously, it won't have any size. An infinite number of zeros is still zero. So, if there is multiplicity, on the one hand, we must have an infinitely big universe which has endless parts. And on the other hand, an infinitely small universe which has sizeless parts. And that's an impossible contradiction. And therefore, the premise must be wrong. There is no multiplicity. Therefore, Parmenides was right after all. There's only the one. The universe is in principle indivisible. That's the end of it. Now, until we get to Aristotle's answer to this, and this, as you see, involves the same kind of issues pertaining to infinity and infinite subdivision that the other paradox did, and all of his do. And you need a certain theory of the nature of infinity to answer it. But until we get there, if you don't know, it's okay to go home. You can assume pragmatically that you are one part, and your home is another, and motion between the two is possible. And how we validate that philosophically, we'll discuss in several weeks.